The war in the Atlantic rarely looked dramatic from a distance. No sweeping armored charges, no cities collapsing under artillery storms. Instead, the struggle stretched across millions of square miles of cold water, where cargo ships carrying grain, oil, and ammunition crossed the ocean in long, slow convoys. Yet by 1943, the outcome of that quiet struggle began to fracture the German war effort itself. The numbers involved were staggering. Merchant vessels displaced thousands of tons each and carried cargo measured in tens of thousands of tons. Wheat, fuel oil, aviation gasoline, artillery shells weighing more than 20 pounds, and tank parts required for armies fighting across Europe. Germany tried to bleed that lifeline dry. The weapon used for that task looked deceptively small compared to battleships. A German submarine, or U-boat, displaced roughly 700 tons on the surface and carried a crew of about 50 men. Inside its narrow hull sat torpedoes, each weighing more than 3,000 pounds, designed to punch open merchant ships transporting fuel measured in thousands of barrels. Early in the war, those submarines roamed the Atlantic in groups called wolf packs, wading along convoy routes where dozens of cargo ships moved in slow formation. Imagine standing inside one of those submarines beneath the Atlantic. The steel hull measures only a few inches thick. Condensation drips from pipes above your head. The engine vibrates constantly when the boat runs on diesel power. A torpedo slides slowly into its launch tube, a metal cylinder weighing over a ton, waiting for the command to fire. At the strategic level, the stakes were brutally simple. Britain imported enormous amounts of food, oil, and raw materials by sea. Tank armies in North Africa burned hundreds of tons of fuel each week. Aircraft factories required aluminum and steel delivered by ships crossing the Atlantic. If the U-boats could sink enough cargo vessels, the supply system sustaining Allied armies would erode until entire campaigns stalled. During the early years of the war, the submarines achieved terrifying results. Convoys sometimes lost several ships in a single night. Tankers carrying thousands of barrels of oil erupted into flames visible for miles. Cargo vessels loaded with ammunition detonated violently when torpedoes struck their hulls. But by 1943, something began to shift. The Allies recalibrated their approach to the Atlantic War. Shipyards in North America launched new cargo vessels faster than submarines could sink them. Escort destroyers equipped with sonar scanned the ocean for submerged targets. Aircraft flying from long-range patrol bases dropped depth charges weighing several hundred pounds into suspected submarine positions. Convoys themselves grew larger and more tightly defended. Instead of scattered merchant ships crossing the ocean alone, dozens sailed together, surrounded by warships carrying guns firing shells heavier than 20 pounds. Picture the deck of one of those escort destroyers during a stormy Atlantic night. The ship weighs several thousand tons and rolls violently in heavy seas. Sailors grip the railing, while radar operators below deck search for the faint signals of a submarine approaching beneath the waves. When a sonar contact appears, everything moves quickly. Depth charges, explosive cylinders weighing hundreds of pounds, roll off the stern of the destroyer into the ocean. Seconds later, the water erupts with thunderous blasts. Each explosion sends shockwaves through the sea, strong enough to fracture the steel hull of a submarine lurking below. Inside a U-boat caught in that attack, the crew hears the concussions echo through the pressure hull. Bolts rattle, gauges shake. The captain orders the vessel deeper, while electric motors hum quietly to avoid detection. During 1943, those confrontations multiplied across the Atlantic. Allied radar technology improved dramatically. Aircraft equipped with radar sets capable of detecting submarines on the surface began patrolling areas once considered safe for U-boats. When those aircraft spotted a submarine recharging its batteries at night, bombs and rockets followed. I remember reading a German naval report from the spring of 1943, describing the change in tone among submarine commanders. Earlier entries spoke confidently about wolfpack tactics and tonnage sunk. Later reports mention aircraft appearing suddenly from darkness and escort ships arriving faster than expected. The numbers in those documents reveal the shift clearly. Submarine losses climbed sharply. In May 1943 alone, more than 40 German U-boats were destroyed. Each submarine represented months of construction, tons of steel, engines, torpedoes weighing thousands of pounds, and crews trained through long and difficult programs. Meanwhile, Allied convoys began reaching their destinations with fewer losses. Cargo ships continued delivering supplies measured in millions of tons across the ocean. Tanks weighing over 30 tons rolled off transport ships in British ports. Aviation fuel moved in massive quantities to airfields preparing bombers carrying payloads measured in thousands of pounds. The Atlantic War had not ended, but the arithmetic had tilted. German submarines could still strike convoys, but the cost of each attack grew heavier. Escort carriers joined convoy defenses, launching aircraft capable of hunting submarines across hundreds of miles of ocean. Radar, sonar, codebreaking, and industrial production collided together to erode the effectiveness of the U-boat campaign. Sometimes, when I study naval charts of the Atlantic from 1943, I pause at how enormous the battlefield truly was. Ships moved across routes thousands of miles long, while submarines hunted in darkness beneath waves hundreds of feet deep. Yet within that vast space, decisions made in command rooms and shipyards determined whether armies in Europe received the supplies they needed. Imagine the Atlantic at night during that year. Convoys stretch across the horizon, each cargo ship carrying thousands of tons of grain, oil, or machinery. Beneath the waves somewhere, a submarine captain studies his charts, calculating the distance to the convoy while listening for sonar pulses in the darkness. And if you are listening now as the day fades and your thoughts begin slowing towards sleep, picture that same ocean long after the war ends. Waves roll quietly across waters where destroyers once dropped explosives and submarines waited silently below. This is the entire history of the Battle of the Atlantic in 1943, the year the tide began to turn. Chapter 1. The Inheritance of Disaster. The 1st of January 1943. Liverpool. The Western Approaches Command Building on Derby House sits quiet in the early morning. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, it's held breath. Somewhere inside, behind blackout curtains thick enough to muffle the world, a duty officer is sitting with a carbon copy. The paper is faintly warm from the roller of the duplicating machine. The ink hasn't quite dried on the last column of figures. There's a smear across one number. 7,790,697. A smear that makes it look almost redacted. Almost. Someone has circled that figure in blue wax pencil, pressed so hard the tip has left a groove in the paper beneath. That number is the total Allied gross tonnage sunk in 1942 alone. It doesn't look like a catastrophe. It looks like an accounting error. It was neither. Britain had been at war for over 3 years by this point, and the people who understood what the Atlantic meant, really understood it in their bones, were a small and increasingly sleepless group of planners, analysts, and naval officers scattered across a handful of classified buildings. They didn't talk about it publicly. They couldn't. But the mathematics they were carrying around in their heads was genuinely terrifying. Britain needed more than 1 million tons of imported material every single week to keep fighting. Food, fuel, raw materials, weapons, ammunition. Everything came by sea. Everything crossed the Atlantic. And in 1942, the Germans had been sinking ships faster than anyone was building them. The replacement rate at American yards, though accelerating dramatically under the pressure of wartime production, was running at approximately 5 million tons per year at the close of 1942. The losses were running at nearly 8 million. The gap between those two numbers was not just an accounting problem. It was a slow-motion civilizational emergency. What makes the archive from this period so strange and so compelling is the gap between what the numbers say and what the public record shows. The British government was not lying exactly, but it was carefully managing the scale of what was happening in the North Atlantic. Newspapers reported individual sinkings in vague terms. Casualty figures for merchant seamen were not published. The Admiralty's internal communications, however, the ones that didn't go anywhere near Fleet Street, tell a completely different story. When I first worked through the Western Approaches Command War Diaries from late 1942 and early 1943, what struck me wasn't the dramatic entries. It was the routine ones. The dates, the convoy reference numbers, the terse notation of ships lost, positions noted, escorts released. The bureaucratic steadiness of the prose against the scale of what it was recording. Men dying at sea, noted in the passive voice, filed, and moved on from. The U-boat fleet that Admiral Karl Donitz commanded at the start of 1943 was 212 boats strong and operational. That number needs a moment to land. At the start of the war in September 1939, he had 57 submarines. He had pleaded, cajoled, and argued for a fleet of 300 medium Type 7 boats since before the war began. His calculation, set out in a pre-war memorandum to Grand Admiral Raeder, was that this number could sink 1 million tons of Allied shipping per month and strangle Britain within 12 months. He never got his 300. He peaked at 212. But 212 was still, by the standards of what the Allies could muster against them in the North Atlantic, an overwhelming force. The Wolfpack system that Donitz had designed meant that when a convoy was found, every available boat within radio range converged on it. 15, 20, sometimes 30 submarines attacking in sequence through the night. It was not a tactic. It was a coordinated industrial process for the destruction of shipping. The operational heart of the Wolfpack system was the Mid-Atlantic air gap. Here is the geography of the crisis in one sentence. Allied shore-based aircraft flying from Britain, Iceland, Canada, and the eastern United States could cover the outer edges of the convoy routes. But there was a corridor of roughly 600 miles at the center of the North Atlantic where no land-based aircraft could reach. The patrols flying from Iceland couldn't get there. The patrols flying from Newfoundland couldn't get there. In that corridor, convoys were on their own. Escort ships only. No air cover. For the Wolfpacks, this gap was the killing ground, and they used it systematically. The Allies knew exactly what it was and exactly what it was doing to them. The aircraft that could close it, specifically the very long-range variant of the consolidated B-24 Liberator, modified with additional fuel tanks, existed. They just weren't there. Why they weren't there is a story that belongs to a later chapter, and it's a story that I find genuinely difficult to read without frustration. The Type 7C U-boat that made up the bulk of Donitz's operational fleet was a machine of specific, measurable capability. It displaced 761 tons surfaced. It could make 17 knots on its diesel engines on the surface. Submerged, running on electric motors, it could manage approximately 7.5 knots, but only for an hour or so before the batteries needed recharging. This meant that a U-boat was fundamentally a surface vessel that could temporarily disappear. It lived on the surface. It attacked predominantly on the surface at night. It dived only when threatened. And on the surface, in the darkness of the Mid-Atlantic in 1942 and the first months of 1943, it was very nearly invulnerable. Allied radar at this point was still operating on 1.5-meter wavelengths, generating enough wave clutter returns in rough weather that a submarine's low silhouette was effectively invisible at anything beyond close range. The ASDIC, the underwater detection system, only worked against a submerged boat. A surface submarine was, at night, in heavy seas, essentially a ghost. What I find most telling about this period, when I work through the convoy records from the winter of 1942 to 1943, isn't the dramatic convoy battles. It's the ships that turned back. The Commodore's logs occasionally note, without comment, that a vessel has reversed course, returning to port rather than continuing into the Black Pit. Fear had become its own form of attrition. Some of these decisions were based on mechanical failures, genuine ones, but some were master's decisions made in full knowledge of what lay ahead on the convoy track. These are the losses that don't appear in the tonnage statistics. They represent a kind of soft collapse of confidence that the official record only hints at, but that survivor testimonies and port authority logs make absolutely clear. Across the Atlantic, the picture was beginning, very slowly, very tentatively, to shift. American shipyards, energized by the extraordinary administrative machinery of the War Production Board, were building Liberty ships at an accelerating rate. By the latter months of 1942, a single Liberty ship, the standard EC2-SC1 hull type, was being completed every 4.5 days at the most productive yards. The Kaiser yards in California had reduced the average build time from 244 days to an astonishing 41 days by the end of the year. But here is the brutal arithmetic that the Western approach's analysts were living with. You can mass-produce a ship in 41 days. You cannot mass-produce a trained merchant officer in 41 days. The chief engineers, the masters, the navigators, men with decades of sea time, were not replaceable on any industrial timeline. The human pipeline was broken in a way that no shipyard could fix. The Casablanca Conference, held in the Moroccan city across the 14th to the 24th of January, 1943, brought Roosevelt and Churchill together with their combined chiefs of staff, and it produced a formal statement of Allied priorities. The defeat of the U-boat was named, explicitly, as the first priority of the Allied effort. This should have resolved the desperate shortage of maritime patrol aircraft. It didn't. The minutes of the conference reveal a sharp and insufficiently documented disagreement between American and British air staffs about the reallocation of Liberator bombers from strategic bombing duties to Atlantic patrol. The combined chiefs produced a statement of intent. They did not produce a specific aircraft reallocation order. Statements of intent, as anyone who has read military bureaucratic history knows, are not the same thing as orders. The gap between them, in this case, would be measured in ships. By the end of January 1943, the Derby House Atlantic plot showed something that any honest observer would have called a crisis. The convoy system was working, in the sense that the majority of ships were still getting through, but the margins were shrinking and the losses were accelerating. That blue wax pencil circle on the tonnage figure wasn't anger or alarm. It was a mathematician's notation. Someone had identified the number that mattered most. The number that, if it kept growing at the current rate, would eventually mean something that couldn't be said in a duty officer's report. It would mean that Britain was losing the war. Not on the beaches, not in the skies over London. In the gray, cold, anonymous expanse of the North Atlantic, where nobody was watching and where the mathematics was running out of room. Chapter 2. Dunitz's Arithmetic, the man who thought he could count his way to victory. The 14th of January, 1943. The Wolfschanze, Hitler's eastern headquarters in the Missourian forest. Outside, the temperature is somewhere around -15 degrees Celsius. Inside, in one of the concrete bunker rooms that smell of damp and diesel heating, Karl Dönitz is being told he is now commander-in-chief of the entire German Navy. He is 51 years old. He has spent 4 years building a submarine force that he genuinely believed could win the war alone. He has not been given that chance. He has been given something larger, more complicated, and considerably more dangerous. Responsibility for everything that floats under the German naval ensign at the precise moment when nearly everything that floats under the German naval ensign is either being sunk, bottled up in port, or politically inconvenient. It was, as promotions go, a poisoned chalice delivered with a straight face. To understand what Dönitz was attempting in 1943, you have to go back further, to a handwritten document in the German Federal Military Archives at Freiburg, a pre-war memorandum in which the then commander of U-boats set out, with the precision of an actuary, exactly how Germany could defeat Britain. The arithmetic was elegant. Britain depended on approximately 3,000 merchant ships to keep its economy and war effort functioning. Those ships totaled roughly 17.5 million tons of carrying capacity. If Germany could sink 1 million tons per month, a sustained rate achievable, Dönitz calculated, with 300 operational Type 7 U-boats, Britain would run out of shipping within 17 months. The island nation would be strangled. The logic was sound. The assumptions were catastrophically wrong. The assumption that Allied shipyards couldn't build fast enough. The assumption that Allied science couldn't find a countermeasure fast enough. The assumption that 300 U-boats would be built. He got 212. The gap between 212 and 300, in the logic of his own arithmetic, was the gap between victory and defeat. He never quite acknowledged this. What the BDU War Diary, the operational log of U-boat command, reveals about Donitz's management style is interesting and, depending on your perspective, either admirable or alarming. It is maintained in a tone of rigorous professional detachment. Sinkings are recorded as tonnage. Losses are recorded as boat numbers. The prose doesn't deviate. It doesn't editorialize. When I was cross-referencing the BDU diary entries from January and February of 1943 against Donitz's post-war memoir, I kept finding this dissonance. The memoir presents a commander who was privately pessimistic, who knew the technological balance was shifting, who was warning Hitler of impending difficulties. The operational diary from the same period presents a commander issuing optimistic projections, expanding patrol lines, assigning new Wolfpack group names with a confidence that reads, in context, as either genuine belief or deliberate performance for the record, perhaps both. The operational mechanics of the Wolfpack system were, by early 1943, reaching a level of choreographic complexity that is genuinely difficult to reconstruct from the documents alone. The system worked in stages. A line of U-boats, typically between 15 and 25 boats, would be positioned across a projected convoy route, spread at intervals of roughly 30 nautical miles. When one boat sighted a convoy, it didn't attack immediately. It shadowed. It transmitted a series of short homing beacon bursts on high-frequency radio. BDU in Paris, now relocated from Lorient, received those transmissions, calculated the convoy's position and course, and rebroadcast coordination orders to every boat in range. The other submarines then sprinted on the surface to converge on the beacon. Depending on sea conditions and available boats, a fully assembled Wolfpack could be in attack position within 12 to 36 hours of initial sighting. It was not improvised. It was drilled to the point of reflex. The Type 7 U-boat carried 14 torpedoes on a standard North Atlantic patrol, a mix of compressed air G7A models, which left a visible white wake, and the electric G7E, which was effectively wakeless and was preferred for night surface attacks. At the exchange rates of early 1943, a single successful patrol could account for 10 or 12 merchant vessels. The average U-boat patrol lasted approximately 8 weeks. During that time, the crew of roughly 44 men lived in a space approximately the size of a large articulated lorry. The internal temperature varied between extremes, freezing on the surface in North Atlantic winter, suffocatingly hot near the engine spaces below. Everything was saturated with diesel. The condensation inside the pressure hull produced a constant, slow drip on every surface. The food deteriorated rapidly, and by the third week of a patrol, fresh provisions were long gone. What made men willing to do this repeatedly is a question the archive doesn't fully answer. The command infrastructure that directed these boats from Paris was remarkably lean for what it was attempting. The BDU operations staff was small, a handful of officers maintaining the Atlantic plotting table, tracking boat positions from radio reports, managing fuel and torpedo states, issuing patrol line reassignments. The communication system that held this together was high-frequency radio, powerful, long-range, and, as the Allies had quietly understood for some time, interceptable. Every transmission from BDU to a submarine at sea was, in principle, a piece of intelligence that could be read. The Germans knew this, of course. They believed their Enigma cipher machine made those transmissions unreadable. Their confidence in the machine was close to absolute. It was also, as 1943 would demonstrate in increasingly brutal terms, completely misplaced. But in January of that year, from inside the BDU operations room, the system looked robust. The patrol lines were being placed. The convoys were being found. The tonnage figures were good. It fascinates me, going back through the records of this period, how completely Donitz inhabited his own mathematical framework, even as the edges of it were beginning to fray. The December 1942 sinking totals had been strong, over 300,000 tons in the Atlantic alone. January 1943 was also producing results. From inside the BDU operations room, looking at the plotting table, the Wolfpack system was functioning. What wasn't visible on that plotting table was the rate at which Allied operational research was redesigning the Escort system, the rate at which American industry was accelerating, the rate at which Bletchley Park was reading the mail. The plotting table showed where the convoys were. It didn't show what was being built in the shadows around it. The Lorient submarine pens, those vast, reinforced concrete structures on the Brittany coast that house the Atlantic U-boat force, represent one of the stranger engineering paradoxes of the war. The pens had roofs of concrete up to 7 meters thick in places. RAF Bomber Command dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Lorient in early 1943. The raids were devastating to the town and to the French civilians who lived there. They were almost completely ineffective against the submarines inside the pens. The concrete held. The boats sailed. The French town was largely destroyed for no measurable military return. This is a fact that the post-war British official history handles with characteristic understatement, noting that the tactical results did not justify the effort. That is one way to put it. The German Navy's investment in the U-boat campaign, when you look at the full financial and industrial picture from the Reich's wartime economic records, is astonishing in its scale. Post-war analysis of German military expenditure revealed that the Navy spent more money producing naval vessels across the entire course of the war than the German Army spent on every type of ground vehicle combined, including all tank production. Every Panzer, every half-track, every self-propelled gun. The submarine program outspent them all. This is not a fact that appears in popular histories of the Atlantic campaign, and it ought to. It tells you what the German High Command actually believed about where the war would be decided. Not in the Ukraine, not in North Africa, in the gray water between America and Britain, where a man in a steel tube with 14 torpedoes was the strategic instrument of choice. By the end of January 1943, Donitz had settled into his dual role as commander of the Navy and commander of U-boats, with a focus that his staff noted was intense even by his own demanding standards. He was 51 years old and had been building toward this campaign for over a decade. He believed, and the operational record of the previous 3 years gave him reasonable grounds for that belief, that he was close to achieving his strategic objective. The tonnage war was running in his favor. The replacement rate seemed, from his vantage point, insufficient to offset the losses. The patrol lines were extended. The boats were sailing. The radio traffic between Paris and the Atlantic was constant, dense, and, he was certain, unreadable. He was wrong about the last of those things, but in the darkness of January, in the warmth of the Paris operations room, with the plotting table showing 175 boats at sea or preparing to sail, wrong was not yet visible. Chapter 3. The Wren Who Saw the Grid, Signals Intelligence, and the Secret War Beneath. The 9th of January, 1943. 3:47 in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time. Somewhere in the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center in London, a building that the bombers hadn't yet managed to find and the public had never heard of, a teleprinter is receiving a signal. The paper is coming off the machine in the particular way that teleprinter paper does, a steady mechanical rhythm, a slight smell of hot ink, the words appearing letter by letter in capital letters on the thin, pale strip. The signal is a partial decrypt of a German naval transmission. It carries a grid reference, a possible U-boat position, and a timing that, if acted on, might let a convoy routing officer steer 40 merchant ships around what is waiting for them in the dark ahead. The duty officer's handwritten annotation at the bottom of that signal, filed in what is now the National Archives in Kew, reads, "Position uncertain. Cannot reroute without additional confirmation. Holding." The convoy sailed without rerouting. 3 ships were lost. The story of Allied signals intelligence in the Battle of the Atlantic is one of the most well-documented and simultaneously most misunderstood subjects in the historiography of the Second World War. The popular version goes roughly like this. Bletchley Park broke the German Enigma code, the Allies could read the U-boat signals, and that's why they won. It's not wrong exactly, but it compresses a story that is, in the operational details, far messier, far more uncertain, and far more dependent on human judgment than the clean narrative allows. The Naval Enigma, specifically the four-rotor variant codenamed Triton by the Germans and Shark by the Allies, had gone effectively dark in February 1942, when the Germans added the fourth rotor and the existing bomb machines couldn't handle it. For almost 10 months, from February to December 1942, the submarine tracking room in London was working largely blind. The intelligence picture during that period was assembled from direction-finding fixes, sighting reports, and the extraordinary inferential skill of a small team of analysts whose most important tool was pattern recognition, accumulated over years of watching how the wolf packs moved. The man at the center of that inferential effort was Commander Roger Wynne, a barrister by training who had been recruited into naval intelligence after contracting polio left him physically unable to serve at sea. Wynne ran the submarine tracking room with a methodology that was, in some ways, closer to detective work than to conventional naval intelligence analysis. He didn't just plot what was known, he reasoned about what must be true, given what was known, and what had been true before. His estimates of U-boat positions, produced without access to current Enigma decrypts for most of 1942, were, by any fair assessment, remarkable in their accuracy. This is documented in the subsequent analysis of his tracking estimates against the actual positions revealed by post-war German records. He was right, with striking regularity, about the broad disposition of the Wolfpack lines. He was working largely from inference. When I was reading through Wynne's papers and the tracking room records from this period, I kept having the same thought. This is not intelligence work. This is applied epistemology. A man sitting in a basement in London, reasoning from incomplete evidence about what was happening in 1,000,000 square miles of ocean. The technical breakthrough that made the four-rotor Enigma readable again came in late December 1942, and it came in part because of something that had happened in October. A Royal Navy action in the Mediterranean in which two petty officers, Tony Fasten and Colin Grazier, boarded and entered a sinking German submarine to retrieve technical documents and equipment. They drowned when the boat went down faster than expected. They were awarded the George Cross posthumously. The materials they recovered contributed to the solution of the four-rotor Enigma. Their names appear in almost no popular account of the intelligence war. The bomb machines at Bletchley Park get the credit in most tellings. The men who went into a sinking submarine to get the materials that made those machines work are largely forgotten. The problem that persisted even after the four-rotor naval Enigma was broken, and this is the part of the story that the tidy popular narrative omits, was time. Decrypts weren't instantaneous. The process of intercepting a signal, transmitting it to Bletchley, processing it through the bomb machines, decoding the result, translating it, assessing its operational significance, and distributing it to the relevant commands took, in early 1943, between 18 and 72 hours. The exact time depended on the complexity of that day's Enigma key settings, the volume of traffic being processed, and the staffing levels on that particular shift. 72 hours is 3 days. A U-boat Wolfpack patrol line that was positioned at one grid reference in a decrypt read 3 days later could be anywhere within a radius of several hundred nautical miles by the time the routing officer was looking at it. The intelligence was real. The intelligence was valid, and the intelligence was frequently too old to act on safely. Here is where the shipborne high-frequency direction-finding system, called Huff-Duff by the sailors who operated it, becomes, in my assessment, the most underrated piece of equipment in the entire Allied anti-submarine arsenal. Fitted to escort vessels from late 1942 onward, the HF/DF set worked on a simple principle. When a U-boat transmitted a radio signal, the rotating directional antenna on an escort ship could acquire a bearing on that signal. It took only seconds. A second ship in the same escort group could acquire a second bearing, and the two could be crossed to get a position fix accurate to within roughly 2 to 5 nautical miles. Crucially, and this is what makes it so different from Ultra in operational terms, the Huff-Duff response was immediate. There was no processing delay. There was no distribution chain. The U-boat sent a homing beacon. The Huff-Duff operator got a bearing, and the escort commander had actionable local intelligence in under a minute. The signal that would have taken 18 to 72 hours to work its way through the Bletchley system was, at the convoy level, processed in the time it took to write a bearing on a notepad. The post-war debate about the relative contributions of Ultra and HF/DF to the Allied anti-submarine effort is genuinely unresolved among serious historians, and I think it matters more than most popular accounts acknowledge. The Ultra story has a particular appeal. The heroic code breakers, the secret basement, the machine that changed everything, that makes it the natural focus for narrative histories. The Huff-Duff story is less cinematic. A rotating antenna on a corvette's mast, a set of headphones, a rating in a small compartment, writing down a bearing. It's harder to romanticize. But when you look at the actual distribution of U-boat kills in 1943, broken down by method and initiating intelligence source, the surface ship contribution, the ships that found their contacts through Huff-Duff bearings and shipborne radar rather than routed intelligence, is substantially larger than the popular account would suggest. A specific post-war analysis by the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division found that surface ship attacks, many initiated by Huff-Duff contact, accounted for the largest single category of U-boat kills in 1943. The figure was roughly 43%. Ultra-assisted operations, including both air and surface attacks, accounted for considerably less. The submarine tracking room was also operating under a constraint that the official histories handle somewhat gingerly: the requirement to protect the source. Every time Ultra-intelligence indicated a U-boat position and a convoy was rerouted around it, there was a risk. A risk that the Germans, seeing their patrol lines consistently avoided, would begin to suspect that their communications were being read. The operational security around Ultra was extraordinary, compartmented, carefully controlled, distributed only through secure channels. But it was also, inherently, a constraint on how aggressively the intelligence could be used. Routing a convoy around a located U-boat line was safe in intelligence terms if it could be explained by other means: an aircraft sighting, a merchant ship report. Vectoring a destroyer group directly onto a submerged submarine that only a Bletchley decrypt could have located was a more delicate problem. Cover stories were fabricated. Fictitious sighting reports were inserted into the record. In some cases, as became clear decades later when the Ultra archive was declassified in 1974, the fabricated intelligence became part of the permanent German operational record. The Germans noted the aircraft sighting in their war diary. It had never existed. The Convoy SC-118 battle in early February of 1943 is a case that illustrates the limits of the intelligence system with painful clarity. The convoy was given an evasive route based on OIC tracking data, genuine ultra-intelligence indicating U-boat positions. But the data was approximately 36 hours old by the time the routing decision was made, and the patrol line had repositioned. 13 ships were lost. The intelligence had been real. The timing had been lethal. What the record shows, in the careful language of the OIC post-action analysis, is not intelligence failure in the traditional sense. Nobody withheld the data, nobody misread the decrypt. The system had worked exactly as designed. The ocean had moved faster than the system could follow. Those 13 ships, in other words, were lost not to ignorance, but to physics. The speed of the ocean was greater than the speed of the processing chain. That is a specific and important kind of failure, and it's one that the triumphalist account of Ultra doesn't have room for. What the archive makes clear, and what I think deserves to be said plainly, is that the intelligence war in the Atlantic was not a story of one side reading the other's mail and winning. It was a story of two systems, both imperfect, both partial, both operating under time pressure and institutional friction, producing incomplete pictures of a vast, moving, three-dimensional problem. The Allies had Ultra. They also had Huff Duff. They had direction-finding shore stations. They had aerial sightings, merchant ship reports, submarine contact reports from escorts. All of it was funneled into the submarine tracking room, where Roger Wynne and his staff assembled from these fragments something approaching a coherent picture of where the wolf packs were and where they were going. It was never a clear window. It was always a frosted one. The work of making decisions through frosted glass, under time pressure, with the lives of thousands of merchant seamen depending on the quality of those decisions, that work was done, largely, by a team of intelligence officers and Wren plotters in a classified basement in London, who have never, in any meaningful sense, received the recognition their contribution deserved. By the end of January 1943, the intelligence picture was improving. The four-rotor naval enigma was being read with increasing regularity. But the structural problem of time delay remained. The convoy losses continued. The wolf packs continued to find their targets. Something more than intelligence was needed. Something that could work in real time, in the dark, in mid-ocean, without waiting for a signal to travel from the Atlantic to Paris to Bletchley to London and back again. The answer already existed, fitted to the masts of a growing number of escort ships, in the form of a rotating antenna and a pair of headphones. The sailors who operated it were not cryptographers or mathematicians. They were trained ratings, listening carefully in small, heated compartments, doing something that no bomb machine could do, reacting to what the enemy was doing right now. Chapter 4. The Ships That Fed Britain, the Merchant Mariners, and the Economy of Risk. The 22nd of January, 1943. Somewhere in Britain, the exact town suppressed by the postal censorship system that routed all merchant seaman mail through anonymous P.O. box numbers, a 44-year-old chief engineer is sitting at a table writing the same letter 4 times. The handwriting on each copy is identical. Careful, deliberate. He's memorized it, or something close to it, so that each of his children receives a version that feels written to them alone. The letterhead is his shipping company's, but the company address has been crossed out in pencil and replaced with a censorship P.O. box number. 3 days after this letter was written and posted, he sailed. His ship made it across. The next convoy he joined, in March, did not. The merchant seamen who kept Britain alive in the Second World War occupy an unusual and uncomfortable position in the historical memory of the conflict. They were not in the armed forces in any formal sense. They were employed by private shipping companies. They were paid as civilians. They had no rank structure equivalent to the Navy's, no operational command chain above their ship's master, no formal training in combat or survival. They were, by the bureaucratic definitions that governed wartime Britain, workers. And yet the statistical reality of what they experienced, what they were asked to absorb month after month in the North Atlantic winter, was worse, by the measure of casualty rates per capita, than any branch of the British armed forces. Worse than bomber command aircrew, worse than frontline infantry, worse than the submarine service. Approximately 1 in 4 of the men who served in the British Merchant Navy during the war did not survive it. The figure is somewhere around 25%. It appears almost nowhere in the popular historiography of the conflict. When you work through the compensation and employment records from this period, which are held in a somewhat fragmented state across several archives, including the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich, you find a policy that is almost impossible to defend in retrospect, and that generated genuine parliamentary controversy even at the time. When a merchant ship was sunk, the crew's pay stopped at the moment of sinking. Not when they were rescued. Not when they reached port. Not when they were discharged from hospital for the hypothermia or the burns or the injuries from the explosion. At the moment the ship went down. They received nothing for time spent in lifeboats. Nothing for weeks in hospital. A man could spend 9 days in a North Atlantic lifeboat in January, watching his shipmates die of exposure, and receive, upon arrival in port, an accounting of wages due that stopped at the second the torpedo hit. This policy was maintained, in various forms, until late 1941, when public pressure and parliamentary questioning forced a partial revision. Partial is the right word. The full recognition of merchant seamen's war service, the campaign medal, the formal institutional acknowledgement, took until 2023, 78 years after the war ended. The North Atlantic in January and February was a specific physical environment with specific lethal properties. A man who went into the water in the North Atlantic in winter lost consciousness within approximately 2 to 5 minutes if he had no immersion suit. Death followed within 15 minutes without a properly inflated life jacket providing thermal insulation. Most merchant seamen were not wearing their life jackets when their ships were hit at night, not because they were careless, but because the standard practice on most vessels was to have the life jackets accessible in the cabin rather than worn, and a torpedo hit at night, particularly in the engine room or amidships, could take a ship down in under 3 minutes. The survival rate for men who entered the water without inflation was approximately 12%. These numbers are documented in the Board of Trade investigation reports that followed every sinking. Dry, technical documents that record depth of water, sea temperature, time from sinking to rescue, number recovered, number not recovered, with the same bureaucratic neutrality that seems, the more you read it, like the only possible way to process the scale of what it's describing. The DEMS gunners, defensively equipped merchant ships personnel, added a layer of military presence to the merchant fleet that is sometimes misunderstood in retrospect. They were Army or Royal Navy ratings assigned to operate deck-mounted weapons, typically a 4-inch stern gun, some anti-aircraft Oerlikon 20mm cannon, and whatever else the ship's specific defensive fit included. Their purpose was not to fight off a submarine. A submarine submerged before it could be brought under effective fire in almost every case. Their purpose was narrower and more specific, to prevent a U-boat from surfacing and using its deck gun, which was a standard 105mm weapon on a Type 7, to sink a merchant ship without expending a torpedo. Torpedoes were finite. If a DIMS gun could force the U-boat to submerge and spin a torpedo instead, it had done its job. The DEMS records claim a number of deterrences: U-boats that broke off surface attacks. German U-boat war diaries from the same period record almost none. Both sources are probably partially right, which means both are also partially wrong, and the truth is somewhere in the gap between them that neither side's documentation fully illuminates. The Liberty ship, the mass-produced American cargo vessel that was becoming the backbone of the replacement program, was a vessel of specific and imperfectly understood characteristics. The EC-2SC-1 hull, built by the hundreds at American yards across the eastern seaboard and Pacific coast, was a welded steel design, a departure from the riveted construction of older vessels that allowed for dramatically faster production times, but introduced a structural vulnerability that the War Production Board didn't fully understand when production began. In cold water, specifically below approximately -1 degree Celsius, the steel grades used in the earliest Liberty ships became brittle. The welded joints, subjected to the thermal stress of frigid North Atlantic water and the mechanical stress of heavy seas, were prone to transverse cracking at the hatch combing welds. 3 Liberty ships broke in half during the winter of 1942 to 1943. Not from torpedoes, not from mines, from the ocean. This was a classified defect. It appeared in no public report during the war. The shipyard engineers and the War Production Board knew about it. The masters and crews sailing these vessels were told nothing. I've spent a considerable amount of time with the survivor testimonies from this period, and what strikes me consistently, and I mean this as a genuine observation rather than a rhetorical point, is the almost complete absence of what you might call emotional heroism from these accounts. The men who survived North Atlantic sinkings in 1942 and 1943 described, when they described anything, procedures. A fireman who survived the loss of his ship in the SC-118 battle, his testimony recorded by the Liverpool Board of Trade investigation, described closing a watertight door and then moving to his muster station. He described the sound of the torpedo hitting as the ship breathed in. He survived because he was on watch and was among the first on deck. 3 of the 5 men who shared his mess were not recovered. His testimony contains no emotion. It contains a sequence of actions.
I don't think this is because the man felt nothing. I think it's because the scale of what these men were absorbing, month after month, had pushed individual emotional response beyond the reach of language. The Royal Canadian Navy's contribution to the Atlantic escort effort in this period is one of the most dramatically underreported stories in the entire Battle of the Atlantic. By early 1943, Canada's naval force, which had consisted of a modest peacetime establishment of roughly 1,800 personnel in September 1939, had grown to over 70,000 men and was escorting approximately 40% of all North Atlantic convoy traffic. 40%. Of all the convoys crossing that ocean, nearly half were accompanied by Canadian warships. The ships were, by the standards of the experienced Royal Navy, often undertrained and under-equipped. The RCN had expanded so fast that the training pipeline couldn't keep up. But they were there, in the worst weather, on the worst routes, in the worst months, doing the essential work that kept the Atlantic convoy system functioning. This contribution appears, in most British popular histories of the campaign, as a footnote. In the operational records, it is a pillar. The replacement problem, looked at from the human rather than the industrial side, had a specific shape in early 1943. A Liberty ship could be built in 41 days. A trained merchant engineer, a man capable of keeping a ship's engines running in a North Atlantic gale, of diagnosing and repairing machinery failures at sea, of managing a boiler at the peak of its operating pressure in heavy weather, took 4 years minimum of sea time to produce. The factories could replace the steel. Nothing could replace the experience. The records from this period show a quiet, growing crisis in manning standards that never appears in the tonnage statistics, but that the ship's masters and company managers were writing about with increasing anxiety in their private correspondence. The ships were being built faster than the crews to run them competently could be trained. This was a problem without an industrial solution. By the end of January 1943, the men who sailed the merchant fleet were continuing to sail because they had not been given, by anybody, a clear picture of the odds they were facing. They knew ships were being sunk. You didn't need classified intelligence to know that. You needed only to watch the harbor and count the ships that didn't come back. But the precise scale of the loss rate, the statistical reality of what the North Atlantic crossing represented in survival probability terms, was not information that reached ordinary merchant seamen. They sailed in a kind of managed ignorance, sustained partly by the particular pragmatism of men who have spent their working lives with the sea's indifference as a constant companion, and partly by the simple fact that the alternative, not sailing, was not, in 1943, a meaningful option for most of them. The letter-writing chief engineer knew this. He wrote the letter 4 times because he was a careful man. He sailed because it was what he did. Chapter 5. March's Perfect Storm. SC-122, HX-229, and the week the Admiralty considered defeat. The 16th of March, 1943. The North Atlantic. Sea state 5, building towards 6. Waves between 3 and 5 meters, the kind that don't look dramatic in daylight, but in the dark reduce visibility to almost nothing, and turn every surface on a small ship into something you need to hold on to. Somewhere, approximately 600 miles south of Iceland, a German Type 7C submarine is running on the surface in the darkness. Its commander has received a homing signal. Ahead of him, somewhere in the gray chaos of the North Atlantic night, is a convoy. 2 convoys, in fact, though he doesn't know the second one's exact position yet. The BDU operations room in Paris has positioned 38 U-boats across this stretch of ocean in 3 interlocking patrol lines. The lines are named Raubgraf, Dranger, and Stürmer. The convoys sailing into them are SC-122 and HX-229. And by the time this night is over, something will have happened in the North Atlantic that will prompt the senior staff of the Royal Navy to write internally and with uncharacteristic directness, that the convoy system must be considered, quote, temporarily defeated. The setup for what historians would later identify as the worst Allied convoy defeat of the entire Atlantic campaign had been building for weeks, and the records show a series of independent failures converging with a precision that, if it were fiction, would seem contrived. The routing decision at the OIC was made on the basis of intelligence indicating that convoy HX-229, departing New York and sailing for Britain, could avoid the Raubgraf patrol line by taking a course slightly south of the standard track. The intelligence was accurate at the time it was received, but SC-122, the slower convoy sailing ahead of HX-229 on a roughly parallel track, had already been located by a German shadow. The homing signals were being sent. BDU was redirecting every available boat. By the time the OIC's routing decision was implemented, it was routing HX-229 away from one threat and toward a concentration of submarines that had assembled around a different target, and the two convoys were now converging toward the same area of ocean. The attack on SC-122 began on the night of the 16th to the 17th of March. A German commander in a Type 7C boat, closing from astern in force-7 winds, with spray making the horizon effectively invisible, fired 4 torpedoes in rapid succession into the convoy's rear columns. The timing of the impacts, the gap between the first and fourth explosion, was approximately 11 minutes. 4 ships went down. The convoy's only radar-equipped escort at the time was approximately 3 miles to port, fighting a wave that had stove in part of its bridge superstructure. The attack was over before the escort could reverse course and reach the position. This was not exceptional seamanship on the part of the attacking commander. It was a function of geometry. A convoy spread across a large area of ocean, a small number of escorts covering an incomplete perimeter, and weather conditions that degraded radar effectiveness enough to eliminate early warning. What followed over the next 72 hours was, in the language of the after-action reports, an extended engagement. What it was, in operational reality, was a sustained assault by more than 20 submarines on 2 convoys sailing within 50 miles of each other in deteriorating weather, with escort forces that were adequate in number by earlier standards, but were now, measured against the scale and coordination of what they were facing, critically overstretched. The escort commander of HX-229, Lieutenant Commander Luther, had 6 ships to protect 40 merchantmen across a convoy front that, in the prevailing visibility, he could cover perhaps a third of at any given time. His after-action report, filed from Liverpool on the 24th of March, is one of the most carefully measured documents in the National Archives. He does not claim his group performed inadequately. He does not assign blame. He simply records what happened. Near the end of the report, in the section marked Observations, there is a line that stays with you. The enemy, he wrote, was not repulsed. The enemy was endured. The numbers from this battle require a moment of attention, because they represent the strategic problem in its most concentrated form. 22 merchant ships were sunk, 13 from HX-229 and 9 from SC-122. Totaling 146,000 tons of cargo. More than 360 merchant seamen were killed. Against this, 1 U-boat was confirmed lost and a handful were damaged. The exchange rate was 22-1 in Germany's favor. Berlin radio called it the greatest convoy battle of the entire war. For once, German wartime radio was not inflating the results. The battle was exactly as bad as they said it was. The Admiralty's internal assessment, drafted in the days that followed, contained the word defeat. Not in a heading, not in a formal assessment, in a carefully worded internal memorandum that proposed, as one possible response to the current situation, the suspension of convoy routing through certain zones of the mid-Atlantic if air cover could not be extended. The memorandum, at some point in its circulation, was annotated and amended. Someone crossed out the most explicit passages in red ink and initialed the deletion. The initials were almost certainly those of Admiral Max Horton. When I was working through the analysis of this battle, I found myself coming back repeatedly to the question of the aircraft. Not the U-boats, not the escort doctrine, the aircraft. Three B-24 Liberators from Iceland reached SC-122 on the 18th of March, 5 days into the engagement. Their fuel state allowed them to remain over the convoy for approximately 45 minutes. In those 45 minutes, they forced 5 submarines to submerge and directly prevented at least 3 torpedo attacks. 5 aircraft, 45 minutes, 3 submarines forced down. If you run that exchange rate across the full dimensions of the battle, if you imagine what would have happened had adequate very long-range air cover been available from the first day of the engagement, the mathematics becomes almost unbearable to look at. The aircraft existed. They were based in Britain. They were not in the North Atlantic because they had been allocated elsewhere, and the decision-making chain that had produced that allocation is something this series will come to directly. The technical dimension of why surface radar was failing the escorts in this battle is worth understanding precisely, because it shaped the German tactical choices just as much as anything else. The radar fitted to most convoy escorts in early 1943 operated on wavelengths that generated significant false returns in rough sea conditions, what radar engineers call wave clutter. Above approximately 3-meter wave height, the number of false contacts returned by a surface search radar made it extremely difficult to distinguish a low-lying submarine silhouette from the background noise of breaking waves. Several German U-boat commanders, aware of this limitation through experience, were choosing to attack on the surface at night in heavy weather, specifically because the conditions degraded the escort's detection capabilities. The new Type 271 centimetric radar, operating on 10-centimeter wavelengths that were largely immune to this wave clutter problem, existed in 1943. It was not yet universally fitted across the escort fleet. The boats that had it performed differently that March. The ones that didn't were fighting with compromised instruments. The aftermath of the SC-122 and HX-229 battle triggered a level of institutional response at the Admiralty that is unusual in its speed and its candor. Within days, a series of meetings was convened that brought together the director of the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division, the director of Naval Intelligence, the Air Ministry representative to the Admiralty, and the operational staff of Western Approaches Command. The minutes of these meetings, which are, in places, unusually direct in their assessment of what had gone wrong, identify 3 specific failures: insufficient air cover in the mid-Atlantic zone, insufficient radar capability on the escort vessels, and a convoy routing decision made on intelligence that had been accurate at the time but was operationally stale when acted upon. 3 distinct failures, 3 distinct remedies required. The problem was that the remedies required resources that, in March 1943, were not all available. The aircraft were the most critical shortage, and the story of why that shortage persisted as long as it did belongs to an institutional argument that had been running, with gathering bitterness, since the previous summer. The German perspective on this battle, recorded in the BDU War Diary, is notably different in tone from the Allied post-action documentation. Donitz's notation, after confirming the final count of sinkings, is measured, precise, and evidently satisfied. He writes that the engagement had achieved the greatest success ever recorded in a single convoy battle. The underline beneath that sentence, thin and precise, made with the same pen as the surrounding text, reads not as triumphalism, but as something closer to vindication. He had been arguing for this capability for a decade. The Wolfpack system, the patrol lines, the radio coordination, the concentration of force, all of it had functioned in March 1943 exactly as he had designed it to function. He was right about that. What he couldn't see, from inside the BDU operations room, was that the month he chose to feel vindicated was also, almost to the week, the month that several of the Allied responses to his system began arriving at operational strength. Chapter 6. The Scientists Go to Sea. Operations Research and the Revolution. Nobody named the spring of 1943. A basement room in the Admiralty building in London. The room doesn't look like the place where one of the most consequential intellectual revolutions in military history is being conducted. There are desks with papers on them. There are filing cabinets. There is a blackboard on which someone has written a mathematical expression in chalk that has partially smudged. A fraction, some variables, a relationship between two quantities that turns out to contain an argument with the power to save thousands of lives. The man at the center of this room is Professor Patrick Blackett, Nobel laureate in physics, Operational Research Group Director, and quite possibly the most important person in the Battle of the Atlantic that most people have never heard of. He isn't sinking submarines. He isn't routing convoys. He's doing something that the admirals who command this war regard with a mixture of respect and deep suspicion. He's applying mathematics to their decisions and discovering, with uncomfortable regularity, that the mathematics says they've been doing it wrong. The field that Blackett and his colleagues were developing had a name, operational research, that became standard after the war but was, in 1942 and 1943, still new enough that its institutional standing required constant defense. The basic idea was deceptively simple. Instead of relying on professional military judgment and accumulated doctrine to make operational decisions, you collected systematic data on what had actually happened and used mathematical analysis to identify patterns that intuition might miss. This sounds obvious. It wasn't in the context of a Navy that had been doing things a particular way for 300 years, and whose senior officers had, in many cases, spent longer at sea than the scientists had been alive. The cultural resistance to being told by a physicist that your convoy doctrine was suboptimal was, by all accounts, considerable. Blackett navigated it with a combination of intellectual precision and diplomatic skill that his papers suggest came naturally to him, and with the backing of admirals like Max Horton, who were temperamentally disposed to follow evidence wherever it led. The specific finding that transformed convoy doctrine was, in its pure form, a piece of geometry. Blackett's team had been working through the convoy records, actual operational records, with ship counts, escort numbers, loss figures, track geometries, weather data, trying to identify what variables correlated with convoy loss rates. The relationship they found wasn't intuitive. When they plotted convoy size against the percentage of ships lost per voyage, the curve went the wrong way for a large number of naval officers' assumptions. Larger convoys lost a smaller percentage of their ships. Not slightly smaller, substantially smaller. A convoy of over 45 ships was losing, on average, approximately 1.1% of its vessels per crossing. A convoy of under 25 ships was losing approximately 2.6%. The difference, applied across the full volume of Atlantic convoy traffic, was enormous. And the reason was geometric. A convoy of 60 ships has a perimeter only marginally larger than a convoy of 30 ships. The sea area it occupies is larger, but the boundary that has to be defended, the edge that the wolf packs attack from, scales much more slowly than the number of ships inside it. You could double the number of ships without doubling the escort requirement, because you weren't doubling the perimeter. The institutional resistance to this finding has its own documentary record, and it makes for interesting reading. Several senior admirals argued that a larger convoy made a bigger and more easily located target for searching submarines. Blackett's team countered that locating a convoy in the first place, finding it in the first place in the vastness of the North Atlantic, was a function of how many separate targets the ocean contained, not of how large any individual target was. A convoy of 60 ships and a convoy of 30 ships were both a single target. Two convoys of 30 ships each were two targets across a larger area of ocean. The argument took months to win. When I was reading the internal Admiralty memos from this period, the back and forth between the Operational Research Group and the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division, I found myself thinking about how many crossings happened between the articulation of the mathematical finding and its implementation as doctrine. Convoys kept sailing on the old system while the argument was being resolved by committee. The depth charge, which had been the primary anti-submarine weapon for the entire war, was also being reassessed by Blackett's group. The standard practice was to set depth charges to detonate at approximately 100 to 150 feet.
This setting had been derived from experience and doctrine going back to the First World War, and it was based on an assumption about where a submarine would be when the charges detonated, well below the surface, maneuvering, attempting to avoid the pattern. The operations research analysis of actual kill records suggested something different. A significant proportion of successful depth charge attacks in 1941 and 42 were happening against submarines that were still relatively shallow, boats that had been caught in the process of diving and hadn't yet reached deep maneuvering depth. Against a boat at 50 feet, a charge set for 150 feet was detonating below and behind it, resetting the standard fuse depth to 25 feet, which seemed dangerously shallow to officers accustomed to the old settings, roughly tripled the kill probability against a diving submarine. The change was ordered fleet-wide in early 1943. Its effect on kill rates over the following months was measurable and significant. What makes the operations research story particularly resonant, when you sit with the archive long enough to feel the texture of it, is the proximity of the analytical work to its human consequences. Blackett's team wasn't working with abstract variables. They were working with convoy records. The losses they were analyzing had names attached to them: ship names, convoy reference numbers, positions, dates. The mathematical exercise of plotting convoy size against loss percentage was being conducted with data that, if you followed it back to its source, resolved into specific vessels, specific crews, specific families. The analyst building the scatterplot on the graph paper in the Admiralty basement was, in some sense, making direct contact with the deaths that generated each data point. I don't know whether Blackett and his team thought about it that way. The papers don't say. But I find it difficult to read their work without that awareness. There was an American parallel to the Blackett work, running simultaneously in Washington under the auspices of the Navy's Operational Analysis Unit. The American team, including the physicist Philip Morse and his colleagues, was developing findings on aircraft patrol pattern optimization, the most effective search geometry for a maritime patrol aircraft hunting a submarine in open ocean. The answer they derived was a variant of an expanding square search pattern combined with pre-calculated transit corridors based on the most likely submarine positions given speed and direction constraints. The improvement in submarine detection rates from optimized patrol patterns compared to ad hoc approaches was estimated at approximately 60% under controlled conditions. The American findings and the British findings were coordinated through the Combined Operations Research Committees established after the Casablanca Conference, another bureaucratic structure that sounds dull until you consider that its output was probably saving ships. The Hedgehog ahead-throwing weapon, which was entering service on British escort vessels in this period, was itself a product of the same analytical thinking that underpinned the operations research findings. The conventional depth charge attack required the escort to pass directly over the submarine, at which point ASDIC contact was lost for a critical period during the final approach, giving the submarine commander a window to maneuver. The Hedgehog launched 24 contact-fused mortar bombs forward of the attacking vessel in a circular pattern, approximately 40 meters in diameter, while the escort maintained continuous ASDIC contact throughout the approach. Critically, the Hedgehog bombs only detonated on direct contact with the submarine hull. A miss produced no explosion. This meant that an attacking crew knew immediately, from the silence, whether they had missed. There was no post-explosion confusion about whether the submarine had been damaged. The psychological effect on submarine crews of hearing projectiles enter the water without the familiar concussion of a near miss was documented in several survivor accounts as uniquely disorienting. The weapon was not perfect. Its early failure rate was higher than the development teams had hoped, but its operational logic, maintain contact, attack from ahead, remove the dead zone, was a direct application of the analytical thinking that was reshaping every aspect of the anti-submarine effort. By the spring of 1943, the operations research work had begun to produce institutional changes that were visible in the actual performance of the convoy system. The shift to larger convoys was being implemented, cautiously, with resistance at the margins, but being implemented. The depth charge settings had been revised. The patrol patterns for maritime aircraft were being formalized into doctrine. None of these changes made headlines. none of them produce the kind of visible, named victory that fills the popular histories of the campaign. A convoy that doesn't lose ships because its geometry has been optimized doesn't generate an after-action report that anyone remembers. A depth charge that kills a submarine because it's set to 25 feet instead of 150 feet looks, in the record, identical to one that kills a submarine for any other reason. The operations research contribution is, almost by definition, invisible in the primary sources. It shows up only in the aggregate statistics, in the quiet improvement in the loss ratios, in the gradual change in the exchange rate between merchant ships sunk and submarines destroyed. What the story of Blackett and the Admiralty Operational Research Group ultimately demonstrates is something about the nature of this particular turning point that the more dramatic narratives miss. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't decided in any single engagement. It wasn't decided by any single weapon or any single intelligence breakthrough. It was decided, in significant part, by a group of civilian scientists in a basement in London who spent the better part of 2 years reading convoy loss records and asking, in a tone that a service culture doesn't always welcome, why the numbers look like this instead of like that. The answer to that question, repeated across enough different problems, convoy size, depth charge settings, patrol geometry, escort positioning, added up to something that, by the summer of 1943, was measurable in the reduced rate at which ships were dying. The revolution had no name. It had a blackboard, a set of files, and a partially smudged fraction in chalk. Chapter 7. The Closing of the Air Gap, a political fight disguised as a technical problem. The 2nd of February, 1943. Northwood, Middlesex. The headquarters of RAF Coastal Command sits in a requisitioned country house that has been thoroughly stripped of anything resembling its peacetime elegance. The rooms smell of cigarette smoke, damp wool, and the particular institutional staleness of buildings that have been running 24 hours a day for 3 years. Air Marshal Sir John Slessor has been in post for less than a week. He is the 3rd Commander-in-Chief of Coastal Command since the war began, and he has inherited, along with his chair and his staff, a problem that his predecessors had been documenting with increasing frustration since the autumn of 1941. The problem is simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to solve. His command is responsible for the air war over the Atlantic. The aircraft needed to fight that war, specifically the very long-range B-24 Liberator bombers, capable of reaching the mid-Atlantic air gap, are not in his command. They are in Bomber Command. And the man who commands Bomber Command believes, with the force of a moral conviction rather than merely a strategic preference, that he needs every one of them. The Mid-Atlantic air gap, that corridor of roughly 600 miles at the center of the North Atlantic where no shore-based aircraft could reach, had been identified as the primary killing ground of the Atlantic campaign since at least mid-1942. The mathematics was straightforward and brutal. In the zone covered by Allied air patrols, U-boat attacks on convoys were dramatically less frequent and dramatically less successful. A surface submarine, even at long range, was vulnerable to an aircraft. It had to dive, abandoning its attack position, losing hours of recovery time. In the air gap, there were no aircraft. The submarines were free to operate on the surface, to sprint ahead of located convoys, to concentrate their patrol lines and attack at will. The losses that occurred in the air gap zone were, statistically, the worst losses in the entire Atlantic campaign. Everybody at the operational level knew this. The solution? More very long-range aircraft in the right places was known and agreed upon by virtually every officer with any direct involvement in the Atlantic battle. The aircraft existed. The problem was where they were being pointed. Arthur Harris, Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief of Bomber Command, was not a simple man, and his position was not a simple one. He had been directed, by the Casablanca Directive of January 1943, to pursue the strategic air offensive against Germany with maximum force. His bombers were destroying German industrial cities, or attempting to, the accuracy debate being one that his staff would rather not have in public, and he argued, with characteristic force and characteristic refusal to entertain counter-argument, that diverting very long-range liberators to Atlantic patrol duty would represent a strategic misallocation with consequences for the bombing campaign that would ultimately prolong the war by months. This argument was not obviously wrong. The bombing campaign was absorbing enormous German defensive resources: fighters, anti-aircraft artillery, labor for repair. Harris was not indulging in institutional self-interest without strategic basis. But from Schleser's perspective at Coastal Command, and from the perspective of every convoy escort commander who had watched ships go down in the air gap, the argument was being made by a man whose command was not watching the merchant fleet bleed out on the North Atlantic. Schleser's private papers, held at the RAF Museum at Hendon, contain a draft letter to the Chief of the Air Staff from February of 1943 that captures the frustration of his position with a vividness that the sent version, toned down for institutional consumption, does not. In the draft, Schleser compares his situation to a fire brigade that has been given efficient engines but is required to drive them past the burning building in order to destroy a factory 3 miles away. The line was cut before the letter was sent. Someone, possibly Schleser himself, the word "too much" appears in the margin beside it, decided that the metaphor was too pointed for a document that would be read by Harris's allies as well as his own. What struck me when I first read that draft was not the rhetorical sharpness of the deleted sentence. It was the care with which it was deleted, carefully circled, the marginal note precise and small. Even in a private draft, in the middle of a crisis, the institutional culture of the wartime RAF required a certain management of anger. The Casablanca directive's failure to resolve the aircraft allocation question was a specific institutional failure with a specific shape. The combined chiefs of staff had stated, in formal conference minutes, that the defeat of the U-boat was the first priority of the Allied effort. This statement should have carried operational weight. It should have generated a specific reallocation order. It did not, because the statement of strategic priority and the decision about which aircraft went where existed in different parts of the command structure, and the people with the authority to translate the first into the second either lacked the will or the specific directive to do so. When I was cross-referencing the Casablanca conference documents against the Coastal Command operational records from February and March of 1943, I kept finding this gap, the gap between what had been decided in principle and what was being implemented in practice. The principle said the Atlantic mattered most. The practice said the bombers kept flying to Germany. The Washington Convoy Conference of March 1943 was the meeting that finally forced the question to resolution, and it did so through a combination of statistical argument and, one suspects, the particular clarity that very bad recent events provide. The SC-122 and HX-229 disaster had happened while the conference was being organized. The loss figures were on the table when the delegates sat down. American representatives arrived with specific proposals for increasing Liberator deployment to the Atlantic routes. British naval delegates arrived with requests for escort carrier transfers. The proceedings ran across 4 days. The key decision, the redirection of 10 very long-range B-24 aircraft from Bomber Command to Coastal Command for North Atlantic patrol duty, was made on the 3rd day. Reading the conference minutes, that decision looks, in retrospect, completely obvious. It looks like the kind of decision that should have been made 8 months earlier. The conference took 4 days to make it, after more than a year of argument. Hundreds of ships and thousands of lives occupied the space between the argument and the decision. The Very Long-Range Liberator, as modified for maritime patrol from Aldergrove in Northern Ireland, was a machine of specific and painstakingly achieved capability. The standard B-24D had its bomb bay fuel tanks augmented to add approximately 1,200 additional gallons of aviation fuel. The ventral ball turret, the rotating gun position beneath the fuselage, was removed to reduce aerodynamic drag and extend range. An ASV Mark III centimetric radar set was installed in a retractable radome beneath the aircraft, and under the port wing, a lee light, a 24-inch searchlight capable of 22 million candle power, was fitted for night illumination of surface submarines. The combined effect of these modifications was to extend the aircraft's effective patrol range to approximately 2,300 nautical miles from base. From Aldergrove, that was just enough to reach the deepest point of what had been the air gap. From Iceland, with different fuel calculations, slightly further. The gap wasn't just closed. It was, for the first time, genuinely contested from the air. The operational results of the first very long-range patrols over the mid-Atlantic in April 1943 were immediate and measurable. In that single month, 3 U-boats were confirmed destroyed by Coastal Command liberators operating in what had been the air gap zone, more than in the previous 6 months of Atlantic air operations combined. The mathematics of why was straightforward. A surfaced U-boat that had previously operated with confidence in the gap now had to reckon with the possibility of an aircraft at any moment. This changed the tactical calculus for submarine commanders in the gap zone. The choice was no longer between surfacing to sprint and submerging to hide. It was between surfacing and accepting a significant risk of aircraft attack, or staying submerged and accepting a dramatic reduction in mobility. Neither option was comfortable. For the Wolfpack system, which depended absolutely on the ability to sprint on the surface ahead of a detected convoy to get into attack position, this loss of confident surface mobility was structurally damaging in ways that went beyond individual boat losses. Simultaneously, the escort carriers, small carriers converted from merchant or naval hulls and capable of operating a dozen or so aircraft, were joining the North Atlantic routes. HMS Biter, one of the first such vessels to operate in the mid-Atlantic, could provide continuous air coverage around a convoy, regardless of the convoy's position in the ocean. This was a qualitatively different capability from shore-based patrol. The aircraft went where the convoy went, regardless of distance from land. The carrier group concept, an escort carrier with its aircraft operating in coordination with a surface escort group, was tested in the late winter and spring of 1943, and the results were sufficient to confirm that the combination was, against a wolf pack, close to decisive. A convoy with its own air cover was a fundamentally different problem for a U-boat commander than a convoy without it. The submarine that could sprint on the surface ahead of a naked convoy now had to submerge every time a swordfish biplane appeared on the horizon. By April of 1943, the air gap was no longer an air gap in any operationally meaningful sense. It was still a long way from land. The weather was still appalling. The ocean was still hostile. But the certainty that a surfaced submarine could operate there unmolested, the geometric confidence that had underpinned Donitz's wolf pack disposition since the beginning of the campaign, was gone. It had been removed not by any single dramatic achievement, but by a grinding, bureaucratically contested, institutionally expensive political argument that had lasted over a year and that had been resolved, finally, not by strategic enlightenment, but by the pressure of catastrophic losses and a conference in Washington. Arthur Harris kept his bombers. He kept more of them than Coastal Command thought appropriate. But 10 aircraft, 10 modified B-24s at Aldergrove, had begun to change what the mid-Atlantic Ocean was. Chapter 8. The Huff Duff Hunters. Escort Group B-7 and the New Doctrine of Aggressive Defense. The 22nd of April, 1943. Liverpool Docks. The morning air carries diesel exhaust, salt, and the smell of rope, the perpetual smell of a working harbor that has been running without pause for 3.5 years. At one of the escort berths, HMS Duncan, a D-class destroyer, is completing its stores and fuel. Tied alongside, or anchored nearby, are the other vessels of Escort Group B-7, a mix of destroyers, frigates, and corvettes, their hulls streaked with rust lines from the Atlantic, their upper works carrying the particular weathered look of ships that have been at sea more than they've been in port. The group's commander is Lieutenant Commander Peter Gretton, 30 years old, Royal Navy, a man described by contemporaries as possessed of an almost physical impatience with anything less than total effort. He is preparing to escort Convoy ONS-5, a westbound convoy of 43 merchant ships, most in ballast, sailing at roughly 7 knots into what will turn out to be one of the decisive engagements of the Atlantic campaign. He doesn't know that yet.
He knows only that the convoy is slow, the weather forecast is terrible, and that there are, by OIC assessment, a significant number of U-boats positioned across the route ahead. The doctrine that Escort Group B7 would apply in the ONS-5 battle was not entirely new, but it hadn't yet been universally adopted, and the resistance to it within the escort fleet reveals something important about how military institutions change. The traditional escort doctrine, conservative, defensively oriented, held that an escort's primary duty was to stay close to its convoy. If a submarine contact was made or a huff-duff bearing acquired, the escort would move toward the contact to the minimum extent necessary and then return to its screening position. The reasoning was understandable. If you leave the convoy to pursue a contact, you create a gap in the screen. The submarine you're chasing may be a diversion. The real attack may come through the gap you've just opened. This logic had sustained Allied escort practice since the beginning of the convoy system, and there was nothing wrong with it as defensive reasoning. But it was defensive reasoning. It assumed that the initiative belonged to the submarines, and the escort's job was to manage that. The new doctrine that Gretton and several other escort commanders were developing turned this assumption inside out. The principle of the new approach can be stated simply, even though its implementation required a significant cultural shift. When you get a huff-duff contact on a submarine transmission, you don't just note the bearing and adjust your screen. You go after it, aggressively. You detach from the convoy if necessary, run down the bearing, depth charge the position, and, this is the critical departure from previous practice, you stay. You stay on the contact and prosecute it to conclusion, even if the convoy moves beyond your radar range in the process. The logic behind this is that a submarine under active depth charge attack cannot transmit homing beacons, cannot sprint ahead to attack position, and is consuming battery capacity at a rate that will eventually force it to the surface or compel withdrawal. A submarine that has been prosecuted aggressively for 4 hours has not sunk any merchant ships. A submarine that was briefly disturbed and then allowed to recover as the escort returned to its screen almost certainly will. The difference in outcome, across the full course of the battle, was the difference between winning and losing the convoy. The HF/DF set that made this doctrine operationally viable was, in its physical form, an unassuming piece of equipment. The Type FH4, shipborne high-frequency direction-finding receiver, was mounted with its directional antenna on the escort's mast, rotating to acquire bearings on signals in the 3 to 30 MHz band. When a U-boat transmitted, a position report, a sighting signal, a homing beacon, the operator watching the display could acquire a bearing on that signal in under a minute if the transmission lasted 15 seconds or more. A second ship in the escort group could cross-cut with its own bearing. The intersection gave a position fix accurate to within roughly 2 to 5 nautical miles. The cost of the FH4 set was approximately £200 per unit. Each U-boat it located was a vessel worth approximately £450,000, crewed by 40 to 50 men. As equipment cost-benefit analyses go, this one was not subtle. The battle for Convoy ONS-5 began in earnest in the last days of April and extended into the first week of May across one of the most hostile sea conditions on the North Atlantic that spring. The convoy was attacked by elements of 2 Wolfpack groups, Fink and Amsel, with over 50 submarines involved at various stages. The initial days produced losses. Merchant ships went down, the weather deteriorated, and at one point, Gretton's own ship, HMS Duncan, was running low enough on fuel that maintaining full convoy speed was becoming a serious concern. But something was different about this battle from the engagements of March. When the Huff-Duff operators picked up transmission bearings, the escorts went. Not tentatively, not for a cursory run to disturb the contact. They went, and they stayed. And the submarines that had expected to shadow and homing beacon and sprint into attack position found, repeatedly, that they were being hunted rather than avoided. The fog that descended over the convoy area on the 4th and 5th of May added a dimension to the battle that neither side had fully calculated. Visibility dropped below 100 yards at times. Submarines that had been operating on the surface at night, using darkness for concealment,
now found themselves in a fog that turned every radar-equipped escort into an unpredictable threat at close range. The Type 2 71 centimetric radar on the escort ships, the newer set that was immune to wave clutter interference, could see a submarine's conning tower in fog at a range of roughly 2 miles. A submarine commander who emerged onto the surface to sprint ahead of the convoy found himself in a sea full of ships he couldn't see, while those ships could detect him. Several submarines attempted to press their attacks anyway. The results, as documented in the British after-action reports and partially confirmed by German war diary entries, were not good for the submarines. The fog that had seemed, in the experience of March, to be the Wolfpack's friend had become, in combination with the new radar and the new doctrine, something else entirely. It is worth being precise about what happened on the night of the 5th to 6th of May, because the detail matters to understanding how the battle was actually won. HMS Pelican, a frigate in the B-7 group, was vectored onto a Huff Duff contact bearing in the darkness and the fog. The contact, later identified as a German submarine, was caught on the surface. Pelican delivered a full pattern of depth charges set to 25 feet, the revised shallow setting now standard across the escort fleet, and the boat went down in under 4 minutes. 3 things had combined to kill it: the Huff Duff bearing that found it, the centimetric radar that tracked it in fog, and the shallow depth charge setting that maximized the lethal effect of the attack. None of those 3 elements had been consistently available in combination to an escort crew 12 months earlier. By May of 1943, all 3 were standard equipment and standard practice. What I find genuinely significant about the ONS-5 outcome, when I read through Gretton's after-action analysis alongside the BDU war diary entries for the same period, is the contrast in what the 2 sides chose to record. Gretton's report is characteristically thorough, almost relentlessly factual, and structured in the passive voice that professional naval reporting defaults to when it wants to describe what happened without editorializing about what it means. He notes the contacts made, the attacks delivered, the losses suffered, the submarines destroyed. The entry in the BDU diary for the end of the ONS-5 battle is notably terse. Heavy losses, convoy not destroyed. 6 words for the end of the engagement. It's a sentence that contains, if you know what preceded it, the recognition of something that isn't quite admitted directly. For the first time in the Atlantic campaign, a convoy battle had ended with more submarines destroyed than merchant ships sunk. 6 submarines gone, 13 merchant ships lost. The ratio had inverted. There's a detail about the ONS-5 battle that almost never makes it into the popular accounts, and I think it matters both historically and as a corrective to the way individual commanders get credit in wartime narratives. Gretton's ship, HMS Duncan, was forced to detach from the convoy and proceed to St. John's in Newfoundland due to fuel exhaustion on the 4th of May, before the most critical phase of the battle. The decisive night engagements of the 5th and 6th were fought by B-7 Group under the command of Lieutenant Commander Robert Sherwood in HMS Tay. It was Sherwood who held the group together in the fog, who directed the Huff Duff pursuit that produced the submarine kills, who made the specific tactical decisions that turned the battle's final accounting. Gretton, in his own post-war account, makes this clear and praises Sherwood without qualification. The popular historiography has, in many instances, attributed the ONS-5 victory entirely to Gretton. Sherwood's name is difficult to find in most general accounts of the campaign. This is an example of something that happens repeatedly in the history of the Atlantic. The record shows one thing, the historical memory shows another, and the men who actually made the decisions in the decisive hours have been quietly edited out. Chapter 9. Black May. 41 U-boats in 31 days. The 1st of May, 1943. The BDU Operations Room in Paris. The Atlantic plotting table shows the disposition of the North Atlantic U-boat fleet at the opening of a month that will, within 31 days, be referred to within the German submarine service by a name that needs no translation. Schwarzer Mai. Black May. The table looks, to anyone who has been watching it for the past several months, like it always looks. A grid of the Atlantic, boat symbols positioned across the convoy routes. Patrol line assignments written in the careful notation of the operations staff. It doesn't look like the opening frame of a catastrophe. Nothing ever does. What made May of 1943 catastrophic for the U-boat arm was not any single battle or any single Allied innovation. It was the simultaneous arrival at operational strength of every improvement that Allied technology, operational research, and institutional reorganization had been building toward across the preceding 18 months. The very long-range B-24 Liberators were now flying regular patrols over the mid-Atlantic. Escort carriers were accompanying convoys at all positions on the ocean. The new 10-centimeter centimetric radar, the set that the German Metox detector could not detect, was being fitted across the escort fleet. The Hedgehog, a head-throwing weapon, was in service. Huff-Duff was standard equipment on escort groups. Support groups, roving hunter-killer groups not assigned to any specific convoy, free to pursue contacts across a wide area, were deploying in the North Atlantic for the first time. No single one of these developments was individually decisive. Their convergence in a single month was. The Metox situation deserves particular attention because it contains one of the stranger ironies in the entire history of the campaign. German U-boat commanders have been relying on the Metox radar detector, a French-manufactured receiver meant to warn them when Allied aircraft radar had locked onto their position, since its introduction in the summer of 1942. The device had provided real operational benefit when Allied aircraft were using 1.5-meter radar, which Metox could detect. But the 10-centimeter cinemetric radar that was now appearing on Allied aircraft and escort ships operated on a wavelength that Metox simply couldn't receive. The device was silent, no warning, and U-boat commanders, finding themselves being attacked by aircraft with no Metox warning, began trying to work out what new Allied technology was killing them. Their conclusion, reached through a combination of technical analysis and, one suspects, the kind of reasoning that happens under extreme stress, was that the Allies had developed an infrared detection system capable of tracking the heat signature of diesel exhaust from a U-boat's engines. In response, German engineers began designing and fitting exhaust shrouds to submarine funnels to reduce the infrared signature. The shrouds caused diesel overheating. Boats began suffering engine damage and mechanical breakdowns from the countermeasure they developed against a threat that didn't exist. They were breaking their own engines to defeat a technology that had never been developed, while the actual technology killing them, the centimetric radar, went unidentified. The convoy battle for SC-130, fought in the third week of May, is one of the more crystalline examples of how completely the tactical equation had shifted. A Wolfpack group was directed onto the convoy by BDU. The attack was pressed with the same operational intent that had produced catastrophic Allied losses just 2 months earlier in the SC-122 battle. The result was 0 merchant ships sunk and 5 submarines destroyed. Not reduced, not driven off to regroup, destroyed. The patrol line that BDU had positioned had been identified by OIC tracking. The convoy had been partially rerouted, the escort group had been reinforced with a support group, and the very long-range aircraft from Iceland had been on station when the first contacts were made. The Wolfpack, encountering this set of conditions, had been methodically dismantled. It was not a victory in the dramatic sense. It was an arithmetic result. The submarine that surfaced to sprint into attack position encountered centimetric radar it couldn't detect, and Huff-Duff operators who had its bearing before it covered a mile. There is a specific entry in the BDU War Diary for the 20th of May, 1943, that I keep returning to. The entry records, among other operational matters, the loss of a submarine identified in the record by its boat number, U-954. The boat was sunk in the SC-130 battle with all hands. Among the crew was a young officer who was Donitz's son, Peter Donitz. He was 21 years old. The BDU diary entry for that day continues. It records patrol dispositions, signal summaries, fuel states, operational assessments. The loss of U-954 is recorded as a boat number among the losses of the period. There is no deviation in tone. There is no separate entry. A father recording, in the language of operational administration, the death of his son, in the middle of a month in which he was recording the deaths of hundreds of other men's sons. I don't write this to generate sympathy for Donitz. I write it because the flat, administrative tone of that diary entry is itself a kind of document. It shows more clearly than any personal account could the particular psychological armature that a man in that position had built around himself. The Bay of Biscay campaign that was running simultaneously with the North Atlantic battles in May of 1943 added another dimension to the crisis. Every French-based U-boat heading to or returning from the Atlantic had to transit the Bay of Biscay, an unavoidable choke point that RAF Coastal Command's 19 Group had turned into an increasingly lethal gauntlet. In May, 15 U-boats were sunk in the bay alone. Donitz's response? Ordering submarines to travel in groups and fight their way through on the surface with enhanced anti-aircraft armament was tactically understandable and operationally costly. Groups of submarines on the surface in the bay were larger radar targets. They invited coordinated air attacks. Several encounters between heavily armed U-boat groups and Sunderland flying boats produced intense exchanges that left damaged aircraft and damaged submarines scattered across the same stretch of water. The official RAF records describe these encounters as successful. The German records describe some of the same events with a notably different emphasis on who came off worse. Both accounts contain truth. The truth that matters strategically is that the bay transit was no longer a routine passage. It had become a cost that every patrol now had to absorb. By the third week of May, Donitz was facing figures that no operational optimism could reshape. In less than a month, 41 submarines had been lost, approximately 1/4 of his entire operational Atlantic force. The exchange rate that had defined the Wolfpack campaign's strategic logic, merchant ships sunk versus U-boats lost, had not just shifted, it had inverted. Where the ratio had once run 70 or 80,000 tons of shipping lost for every submarine destroyed, it was now running in the other direction. Allied convoys were costing more submarines than the submarine losses were costing in shipping. The tonnage war that Donitz had designed and prosecuted for 4 years was not just losing. It was losing in a way that, if continued at the same rate, would eliminate the operational U-boat force entirely within a matter of months. The order that came from the BDU operations room on the 24th of May, 1943, has been quoted many times in many histories. Donitz directed a suspension of North Atlantic convoy operations and ordered a phased withdrawal to areas less exposed to aircraft. The phrase he used, areas less endangered by aircraft, was the operational language. What it described was a strategic retreat. The North Atlantic convoy routes, which had been the principal killing ground of the U-boat campaign for 4 years, were being vacated. The submarines would regroup, refit, receive new weapons, and attempt to find areas where the Allied coverage was thinner. The word Donitz used for the withdrawal in his diary was temporary. He used it twice. The repetition suggests, at least to me, a man telling himself something as much as he was recording it. I want to be careful here about how we hold this. 41 submarines in 1 month, roughly 1,800 German submariners killed in 31 days. The average age of a U-boat crew in 1943 was 21 years old. I am not asking for sympathy for the strategic aims of the regime those men served. Those aims were indefensible, and the merchant ships they had been sinking were carrying food and fuel that kept civilian populations alive. But the specific weight of 1,800 young men dying in the dark at the bottom of the North Atlantic in steel tubes at pressures that exceeded the hull's tolerance, that weight doesn't disappear because the cause was wrong. Black May is a turning point in the strategic sense. It is also, at the resolution where it actually happened, a month of approximately 1,800 individual moments of death in conditions that are difficult to imagine without difficulty. Both things are true simultaneously, and the documentary record requires us to hold them that way. Chapter 10. The Milch Cow Problem. Logistics Beneath the Surface. The 27th of April, 1943. somewhere in the central North Atlantic, the precise coordinates known in 1943 to a small number of people on both sides of the conflict for very different reasons. A German Type 14 supply submarine, large and slow and carrying no torpedo tubes, is preparing to conduct a rendezvous. Waiting nearby, or converging on the position, are 7 Type 7 combat submarines in various states of fuel depletion. The supply boat carries approximately 430 tons of diesel fuel, 16 replacement torpedoes, spare parts, medical supplies, and enough provisions to extend the patrols of those 7 boats by weeks. The rendezvous was arranged by BDU in Paris, the position and timing transmitted in an encrypted naval signal. The signal was intercepted. Decoded at Bletchley Park within 11 hours, distributed to the relevant Allied command through secure channels with the notation, Action, Comage, do not reveal source. A destroyer group was within range of the position. The Type 14 supply submarine, nicknamed the Milchkuh, the milk cow, by the crews who depended on it, was one of the more elegant strategic ideas of the German naval campaign, and its destruction was one of the least celebrated but most consequential Allied operational achievements of 1943. The logic behind the Milch Cow was straightforward and sound. A Type 7 U-boat, operating from Lorient without replenishment, had enough fuel for a patrol that kept it in the North Atlantic for approximately 6 to 8 weeks. This was sufficient for the North Atlantic convoy routes, but barely reached the Mid-Atlantic, and was completely inadequate for the South Atlantic or the Caribbean. With a mid-ocean replenishment from a supply submarine, the same boat could extend its patrol to 14 to 16 weeks and reach patrol areas spanning from the Caribbean to the waters off West Africa to the South Atlantic. The operational range of the entire U-boat fleet was effectively doubled by a fleet of supply boats. Donitz had 10 Type 14s in service by 1943. 10 boats. A small fleet supporting an enormous operational capability. The fuel transfer system that made mid-ocean replenishment possible was technically simple and physically demanding. A Type 14 surfaced alongside a combat submarine, typically maintaining a parallel course at 3 to 5 knots. A flexible rubber hose, approximately 25 meters in length, was rigged between the 2 vessels on the lee side to minimize wave action. The male coupling on the hose mated with a standard fuel intake fitting common to all German submarines. The transfer of a full load of fuel for a depleted Type 7, roughly 40 tons of diesel, took approximately 90 minutes. During those 90 minutes, both submarines were on the surface, stationary relative to the surrounding ocean, connected by a hose, visible from the air, detectable by radar, and incapable of rapid diving. The rendezvous that Allied planners most wanted to find was precisely this: 2 submarines sitting still on the surface, connected by a rubber tube, waiting for diesel to move from one tank to another. An Ultra was telling them where these rendezvous were scheduled to occur. The operational security problem that the Ultra-derived Milch Cow targeting created was, in its way, more delicate than almost any other intelligence management challenge of the Atlantic campaign. If Allied forces appeared at Type 14 rendezvous positions with suspicious consistency, if the Germans noticed that their supply submarines were being intercepted at or near the coordinates contained in their own encrypted signals, the conclusion that the signals were being read would be difficult to resist. The cover stories that Allied commands fabricated to explain each interception had to be credible, location-specific, and varied. A pattern of aircraft sightings from merchant vessels at positions that happened to correspond precisely to BDU rendezvous coordinates would eventually look, to any thoughtful German intelligence officer, like something other than coincidence. The management of this problem, the careful spacing of ultra-derived actions, the insertion of plausible alternative explanations into the operational record, was conducted with considerable sophistication, and it largely worked. The BDU war diary entries for the loss of each supply submarine record, with reasonable consistency, the apparent cause as aircraft contact or Allied surface forces that had been vectored by other means. What the loss of the Milch Cow fleet actually meant in strategic terms can be quantified with reasonable precision. Of the 10 Type 14s in service in 1943, 6 were sunk by July. The boats lost U-459, U-460, U-461, U-462 among them, in a cluster of losses across the spring and summer months, represented a combined investment of considerable manufacturing resources. Each Type 14 cost in construction terms roughly the equivalent of 3.5 Type 7 combat submarines. But the strategic effect of losing them went far beyond the material loss of the boats themselves. With the supply submarine fleet reduced by 60%, the operational range of the entire U-boat force contracted. Patrols that had been able to extend deep into the South Atlantic or the waters off the Azores now had to be cut short. The mid-ocean replenishment options that had given Wolfpack commanders the flexibility to extend patrols until conditions were favorable were gone. Donitz attempted, as a workaround, to use combat submarines as impromptu supply vessels, a role for which they were poorly designed and which reduced their effectiveness in every other respect. He also attempted to shift rendezvous positions to more remote ocean areas. Each new position required a new encrypted transmission. Each transmission was read. What I find most striking about the Milch Cow campaign, going through the targeting records and the ultra-distribution files, is the clinical precision of how the destruction of these boats was managed from the Allied side. The operational logs show a pattern of destroyer group deployments and aircraft patrol assignments that, without access to the ultra files, would look like a series of extraordinarily fortunate interceptions. In some cases, the fabricated cover story, the invented aircraft sighting, the fictional merchant vessel report, is so thoroughly embedded in the Allied operational record that researchers working only from the public documents, without access to the intelligence files that were declassified in 1974, have occasionally cited the fabricated sightings as genuine. The invented intelligence became part of the permanent record. The real intelligence was protected by its own absence from any document that could be read in the wrong places. Donitz understood, by the summer of 1943, that his supply submarine fleet was being targeted with a specificity that wasn't easily explained by improved Allied air coverage alone. His operations staff raised the possibility of a communications security failure. Not necessarily that Enigma was being read, but that there might be a leak somewhere in the signal distribution system, or that Allied direction-finding capabilities were more precise than previously assessed. The correct explanation, that the rendezvous coordinates were being decrypted at Bletchley Park, wasn't reached. The investigation ran in the wrong direction, focused on human intelligence sources and direction-finding capabilities rather than cryptographic vulnerability. This was partly a function of the deep institutional confidence in the Enigma machine's security, and partly a function of the specific, carefully managed way that ultra-derived actions had been structured to avoid obvious patterns. The Germans remained, through the most critical period of their supply submarine losses, uncertain about the exact nature of the compromise. That uncertainty was itself a strategic asset. When I was reading the logistics records from this period, the BDU fuel state assessments, the patrol range calculations, the boat-by-boat operational readiness summaries, I found myself thinking about the Milch Cow commander's position in a way that isn't often addressed in the histories. He commanded a boat with no torpedoes, no meaningful offensive capability, and a profile that made him a high-value target. He could not fight. His only defense was speed of diving, and a Type 14's crash dive time was significantly slower than a combat submarine's. He knew, by the summer of 1943, that other supply boats had been lost. He could see the gaps in the fleet that had existed when he commissioned. And yet, the operational records show these boats continuing to make their rendezvous appointments, continuing to sail to positions that the communication system had specified, continuing to rig hoses across the Atlantic swell. The particular courage of logistical duty, of doing the essential work that keeps other people operational while being the most obvious and least defensible target, appears almost nowhere in the popular history of the campaign. The cascading effects of the milch cow losses on the U-boat campaign's operational geography in the second half of 1943 are worth tracing carefully, because they explain much of what happened to the Wolfpack strategy after Black May. The Azores zone, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge area, the South Atlantic off West Africa, all of these secondary patrol areas that Donitz had developed as alternatives to the now heavily contested North Atlantic routes were dependent on supply submarine support for anything more than brief operations. As the supply fleet shrank, these alternatives contracted. The U-boat force that had ranged across the full width of the Atlantic, from the Caribbean to the African coast to the waters south of Greenland, was progressively compressed toward shorter patrol ranges and constrained options. The Wolfpacks hadn't just been beaten in the North Atlantic. The logistics infrastructure that had given them their operational reach had been systematically dismantled, at depth, by an intelligence operation of extraordinary precision and extraordinary discretion. Chapter 11. The Donkey of the Ocean. Flower-class corvettes and the men who sailed them. The 14th of February, 1943. Somewhere on the North Atlantic, late morning. The ship's engineering log of a Canadian Flower-class corvette records, in handwriting that has clearly been produced on a moving surface, the letters are consistent but the baseline wanders, that the main feed pump bearing has overheated. The petty officer engineering officer has fabricated a temporary collar from the ship's lathe to keep the assembly running. Speed has been reduced to 10 knots. The boiler room temperature is recorded as 122 degrees Fahrenheit. A later entry, in different ink, notes that the fitting held. The log then moves to a routine fuel consumption figure, as if nothing particularly unusual has occurred. A man had made a critical replacement engine component from raw stock, at sea, in a North Atlantic winter, in a compartment hot enough to cause heat exhaustion. The next entry is a number. The Flower-class corvette is perhaps the most improbable fighting ship in the history of the Royal Navy, and given the competition, that is not a modest claim. The design originated at Smith's Dock Company on Teesside, based on a whale catcher hull form, a vessel intended for chasing mammals in the Southern Ocean, not for providing anti-submarine escort to convoys of 60 merchant ships across 3,000 miles of North Atlantic winter. The hull was 62.5 meters long. It displaced approximately 950 tons. Its machinery produced enough power to make roughly 16 knots in calm water, less than anything else, which was most of the North Atlantic most of the time. The design's original name was Patrol Vessel Whaling Type. Someone in the Admiralty procurement chain had the good sense, or possibly the self-awareness, to rename them as flowers. HMS Bluebell, HMS Snowflake, HMS Loosestrife. They went to war with names from a garden, and they fought in conditions that no garden has ever approximated. The decision to deploy Flower-class corvettes as ocean-going convoy escorts was, in the words of the original Smith's Dock designer writing in retrospect in 1947, a complete misuse of the vessel's design parameters. The ship had been conceived for coastal patrol, for operations in sheltered waters, for conditions where a sea state above 4 was unusual enough to count as bad weather. On the North Atlantic convoy routes in January and February of 1943, sea state 4 was frequently described in the convoy commodore's logs as moderate. The corvettes rolled to approximately 40 degrees in heavy swells, beyond the angle at which cooking in the galley was possible, beyond the angle at which walking a straight line below decks was possible, at the angle where sleeping in a hammock required a conscious grip, and where the experience of waking up was frequently the experience of being thrown against a bulkhead. The forecastle, where the lower deck crew lived, was continuously wet in heavy weather through spray ingress. Not periodically, continuously. The crew slept in damp hammocks, in damp clothes, in a space that smelled of diesel, salt, and the particular compound odor of 40 men who have been at sea for 3 weeks in conditions that made fresh water for washing a rationed luxury. The men who served on these ships were, in a substantial majority of cases, men who had been fishermen, farmers, factory workers, and office clerks 18 months before joining the Navy. The Royal Canadian Navy's expansion from 1,800 personnel in September 1939 to over 90,000 by 1943 was so rapid that the training pipeline operated under continuous pressure. A corvette ASDIC operator, the rating responsible for the ship's most critical submarine detection equipment, might have fewer than 40 hours of actual submarine contact experience before joining his first convoy escort. There were no simulators. The training involved exercises with friendly submarines in sheltered coastal waters, conditions that bore only passing resemblance to the operational reality of the North Atlantic in a Force 8 gale. The first time many of these men operated their equipment in the conditions for which it was intended was the first time it mattered whether they could. They were learning the difference between a submarine echo and a thermal layer and a shoal of fish, while the difference between those things had consequences that no training exercise had replicated. The ASDIC compartment on a Flower-class corvette was one of those operational spaces that no equipment manual could prepare you for. It was small, heated to an unusual degree relative to the rest of the ship, and isolating in a way that the technical description doesn't capture. The operator sat with headphones on, listening. The transducer sent pulses, a distinctive pinging sound that is one of the most recognizable audio artifacts of the Atlantic campaign, and the operator listened to the returns. A genuine submarine echo had a specific character, a hardness in the return, a Doppler shift if the contact was moving, a quality that experienced operators described as different from the diffuse returns of fish schools or the sharp metallic returns of wrecks. The difference was learned, not calculated. It was judgment, developed through accumulated hours of listening, that told an ASDIC operator what he was hearing. And it was a judgment made in conditions that included the noise of his own ship's engines, the concussive after effects of recently dropped depth charges that temporarily masked returns, and the fatigue of a watch that had already been running for 4 hours at the end of a 3-week crossing. There is a dimension of the Corvette War that gets obscured when the focus is on tactics and technology, and that is the sheer mechanical fragility of these ships under sustained operational pressure. HMCS Sackville, the last surviving Flower-class corvette, now preserved in Halifax as a museum ship, has a maintenance and operational record that illustrates the problem concretely. Between January and May of 1943, the records indicate 5 separate convoy escort trips, totaling approximately 87 days at sea out of 120. Across those trips, the engineering log documents a continuous sequence of equipment failures, temporary repairs, and workarounds improvised by the engineering watch at sea. Pump failures, shaft alignment issues, fuel system problems. The kind of mechanical attrition that happens to any machine operated at continuous maximum effort in extreme conditions without adequate maintenance periods. The ship's surgeon's log for the same period records 14 cases of exhaustion, 6 lacerations from falls and heavy weather, 2 broken ribs, and 1 case described as profound mental fatigue, a man removed from watch duties and placed on limited duties pending review. The language is the medical officer's. The condition it describes is what the 1943 Navy didn't have an official name for and wouldn't for decades. When I was working through the Canadian escort records for this period, I kept returning to a specific set of figures that I think are underappreciated, even within the specialist literature. By the spring of 1943, the Royal Canadian Navy was providing approximately 40% of all North Atlantic convoy escort coverage. Not 40% of the Canadian contribution to the Atlantic, 40% of the entire Allied effort. Of every convoy crossing the North Atlantic with an armed escort, roughly 2 in 5 were accompanied primarily by Canadian warships. The RCN had grown so fast that it was operating with training standards and equipment fits that its British counterparts privately regarded as inadequate. There were real concerns at the operational level about the state of some Canadian groups, and those concerns are documented in the intercommand correspondence from the period. But they were there. In the worst conditions, on the worst routes, in winter, with ships that were too small, in states of mechanical endurance that should by rights have forced them into dock. They were there. That fact appears in most British popular histories of the Battle of the Atlantic as a secondary consideration at best and a footnote at worst. The Liberty ship fracture problem, the cold water steel brittleness that had broken 3 vessels in the winter of 1942 to 1943, was not something the crews sailing those ships were told about directly. The defect was known in the shipyards and in the War Production Board's engineering files. The fix, a revised steel specification using higher manganese content grades with better low-temperature performance, was being implemented at the yards for new-build hulls, but it was being implemented quietly. Meanwhile, the existing Liberty ships, some with the original brittle steel specifications, were crossing the North Atlantic in water temperatures close to freezing and in sea conditions that placed the welded hull under the kind of mechanical stress for which the original specification had inadequate tolerance. A merchant seaman on a Liberty ship in January of 1943 was sailing on a vessel that could, under specific combinations of temperature and wave stress, fail structurally without any enemy involvement. This was not the primary hazard. The torpedoes were the primary hazard, but it was a hazard that the men facing it had not been told about. And the institutional decision to manage rather than disclose it is one of those details that the official record handles in the passive voice and the popular history doesn't handle at all. The Flower-class corvette story ends, for the purpose of this chapter, not with a battle or a sinking or a technical milestone, but with a small detail from the preserved log of a Canadian vessel in the spring of 1943. In the middle of a routine watch entry, fuel consumption, course, wind direction, there is a line that reads, 0300 hours, all quiet, stars visible for first time in 11 days. The officer who wrote it was keeping a professional record. He included the stars because they were relevant. Star sights allowed for navigational fixes that cloudy conditions had prevented for nearly 2 weeks. But the way the sentence is written, its specific note that stars had been absent for 11 days before they appeared, also reads to me like a man briefly acknowledging something beyond the operational. 11 days of cloud and North Atlantic winter over a small ship, and then, at 3 in the morning, the stars again. The next entry is a position fix. Chapter 12. The Acoustic Torpedo and the Schnorkel. Dunitz's Technological Gamble. The 28th of June, 1943. Eckernförde, on the Baltic coast of Schleswig-Holstein. The Torpedo Experimental Institute, known in German as the Torpedo Versuchsanstalt, or TVA, is running the 14th test firing of a prototype acoustic homing torpedo. The water is calm, the kind of calm that the Baltic provides for test conditions that the North Atlantic never would. The torpedo enters the water from a test installation. It runs forward. Its nose hydrophones detect the propeller noise of the target vessel, a modified test boat equipped with a noise generator. The homing circuit engages. The torpedo turns toward the sound. Impact. The test vessel is struck and begins to take water. In a small room nearby, someone writes in a testing ledger, "Acquisition at 370 meters. Homing achieved. Impact confirmed." In the margin, in a hand slightly different from the main text, a note. Proceed to serial production, 100, required by the 1st of August. The marginal note was written before the results column was completed. The T-5 Zonkönig, translated as the Wren, and known to the Allies when they encountered it in the autumn of 1943 as the GNAT, the German Naval Acoustic Torpedo, was a genuine innovation in underwater weapons technology. It was, in principle, the answer to the problem that had most damaged Wolfpack operations since the spring of 1943, the aggressive escort. If a torpedo could home automatically on the sound of a ship's propellers, without the firing submarine needing to aim it manually, and without the escort being able to evade by maneuvering, the escort vessel itself became vulnerable in a way it had never been before. The T-5 was designed not to sink merchant ships, but to sink their escorts, to strip the convoy of its protection before the main attack. The concept was sound. The execution, as the testing program was already revealing, was considerably more complicated. The acoustic homing circuit of the T-5 used 2 directional hydrophone arrays in the torpedo nose,
positioned on either side of the center line and connected to a simple analog comparison circuit. When the right hydrophone detected greater signal strength than the left, the circuit deflected the rudder to steer right toward the stronger source. When the left detected more, it steered left. The system acquired targets reliably in test conditions: the Baltic, calm water, a single noise source, controlled distances. In operational conditions, the picture was considerably messier. The North Atlantic was not calm. It contained multiple noise sources: breaking waves, marine life, the torpedo's own wake turbulence, the wakes of other ships. The comparison circuit that worked cleanly in Eckernförde Harbor showed a tendency, in rough-following seas where ambient ocean noise was directionally polarized, to mistake the background noise pattern for a target. The torpedo would turn, follow the noise. Occasionally, in a geometry that the test program had not fully explored, it would follow its own wake turbulence back toward its point of origin. The evidence that at least 3 German submarines were lost to their own T-5 torpedoes during the operational period is not conclusive from the documentary record. Those boats were reported as missing without confirmed cause, but it is consistent with the acoustic characteristics of the weapon and with what subsequent analysis of the homing circuit's failure modes would suggest. The Schnorkel development was running in parallel with the T-5 program, and its origins reveal one of the stranger administrative failures of the German naval war. The Schnorkel, the retractable air induction mast that allowed a submerged submarine to run its diesel engines at periscope depth, recharging its batteries without surfacing, was not a German invention. It had been developed by the Royal Netherlands Navy and first demonstrated in 1940. German engineers captured Dutch submarine technical documentation when the Netherlands fell in May of that year. The documentation was reviewed and filed. The concept was assessed and set aside. Serious Schnorkel development didn't begin until 1943, when the need for a solution to Allied surface radar became acute. By the time the Schnorkel was entering production as a retrofit for existing boats, the crisis it was designed to address had already passed its peak. The boats that were being sunk in May of 1943 were dying without it. The boats that would receive it later in the year were inheriting a technology that should have been in service 18 months earlier. The Schnorkel's operational characteristics involved a specific set of trade-offs that its advocates in the German naval staff didn't always represent fully to Hitler's headquarters. A Schnorkel-equipped boat could remain submerged while running its diesels, which meant it was largely immune to the centimetric radar that had been killing surface submarines. This was the benefit, and it was real. But the Schnorkel mast itself was a detectable object, a small radar return at close range, a visible white water disturbance from the air in calm conditions, a source of acoustic noise that sensitive hydrophone systems could detect. More significantly, the process of Schnorkel operation constrained the boat to approximately 5 knots, a speed determined by the wave wash that the mast created at higher velocities, which risked flooding the air intake valve and starving the diesel engines of air. A U-boat traveling at 5 knots submerged could cover approximately 120 nautical miles in a day. A convoy traveling at 9 knots was moving away from it at 4 knots, even if the submarine was heading directly toward it. The Schnorkel solved the radar detection problem. It created a new problem of tactical geometry. A submarine that was always submerged was also always slow. And always slow meant that the convoy interception calculations that the Wolfpack system had been built on, the ability to sprint ahead, position, and attack, were fundamentally compromised. When the T-5 was first used operationally in September of 1943 against the combined convoy ONS-18 and ON-202, the initial results were genuinely alarming to Allied planners. In a matter of days, 3 escort vessels were damaged or sunk by the new weapon. The acoustic torpedo had worked as designed. The Admiralty's response, which is worth examining for what it reveals about the asymmetry of scientific and industrial capacity between the two sides, was to convene an urgent technical assessment, identify the acoustic signature of the T-5's homing frequency, and design a countermeasure. The countermeasure they produced was called the Foxer, or cat gear, a noise-making device towed behind escort vessels on a cable,
generating acoustic signals in the frequency range that the T-5 homed on. The Foxer attracted and detonated acoustic torpedoes at a safe distance behind the Escort. The device was in production within 30 days of the first confirmed T-5 engagement. Fleet-wide issue followed within weeks. The entire cycle, from first combat use of the new weapon to deployed countermeasure, had taken approximately 6 weeks. The T-5 development program had taken over 2 years. What the comparative timelines of weapon development and countermeasure reveal about the relative scientific and industrial capacity of the two sides is one of the more precise measurements available in the Atlantic campaign record. Germany had invested 2 years and approximately 4.5 million Reichsmarks in developing the T-5 program. The Allied Foxer cost approximately 180 pounds per unit to manufacture, weighed 45 kilograms, and was produced in large quantities within 6 weeks of the first combat encounter with the weapon it defeated. This wasn't luck or intelligence. It was the application of a scientific and industrial capability that was, by the autumn of 1943, operating at a speed and scale that had no German equivalent. The Allies weren't just winning the tactical battle, they were winning the research and development cycle, and they were winning it at a pace that meant German innovations were being neutralized faster than they could be produced in operationally significant numbers. When I was working through the TVA testing records from the summer of 1943, what struck me most wasn't the sophistication of the acoustic homing system, it was the pace of the testing program. 14 test firings in 6 weeks, proceeding to serial production before the complete failure mode analysis was finished. The marginal note, 100 units by the 1st of August, was written before the results were confirmed. This is the signature of a program under institutional pressure to produce an answer to a strategic crisis, rather than a program given the time and resources to produce the best answer. The Allies were sinking boats faster than Donitz could find technological responses, and the response to that pressure was to rush weapons to production before they were fully understood. The T-5 was a genuinely innovative weapon. It was also a weapon with failure modes that its own engineers hadn't fully mapped before it went to sea. The submarines that may have been lost to their own acoustic torpedoes were, in a specific and documentable sense, victims of that institutional pressure as much as they were victims of Allied countermeasures. By the end of the summer of 1943, the technological landscape of the Atlantic had shifted from one of relative parity to one of clear and growing Allied advantage. The centimetric radar that U-boats couldn't detect, the hedgehog that maintained ASDIC contact through the attack run, the Huff-Duff that triangulated transmission positions in real time, the very long-range liberators that had closed the air gap. Against these, Germany had the T-5, already being countered, and the Schnorkel, which was solving one problem while creating another. Donitz was not without cards. He was a man who had built his career on tactical ingenuity and strategic conviction, and he was not ready to concede. But the terms of the contest had changed in ways that no individual technical innovation could redress, and the gap between what his boats were encountering at sea and what his operations room in Paris was capable of providing them with was, by September of 1943, no longer a gap that could be closed by imagination or effort alone. Chapter 13. The Liverpool Nerve Center. Western Approaches. Command and the Bureaucracy that Won. The 3rd of May, 1943, Liverpool, Derby House. Somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time. The hours when the North Atlantic wolf pack attacks most frequently came, when the darkness gave surfaced submarines their best cover, and when the men and women on watch in the operations room were running on the particular compressed alertness that comes after the second mug of tea has stopped working. The main plotting room is lit with the flat, even illumination that allows accurate work on the table, but doesn't hurt eyes that have been staring at glass for 4 hours. The room is approximately the size of a tennis court. Its floor is the North Atlantic Ocean, or rather, a representation of it at a scale of roughly 1 to 750,000,
printed on a base map overlaid with acetate sheets marked up in grease pencil. Blue for convoys, red for known or estimated U-boat positions, yellow for contacts, sightings, bearings, white for routing orders. The colors are being updated continuously, in real time, by a team of Women's Royal Naval Service plotters who are doing, without any computer assistance, without any automated correlation, without anything more sophisticated than a pencil and a current awareness of every signal that has passed through the building in the last 30 minutes, something that would not be fully replicated by digital technology for another 4 decades. The Western Approaches Command that Admiral Max Horton had taken over in November of 1942 was not, by the time it reached its operational peak in the spring of 1943, simply a naval headquarters. It was something that didn't have a proper name in 1943, and that military theorists would spend the following decades trying to define. A genuinely integrated, real-time, multi-domain operational command center. The intelligence streams flowing into Derby House included the Operational Intelligence Center's daily submarine tracking room assessment from London, the raw huff-duff bearing reports from shore stations and ships at sea, weather forecasts from the Meteorological Office, aerial sighting reports from Coastal Command, convoy position reports from Commodores, and escort group contact reports. All of it arrived through teleprinters, radio receivers, and telephone lines into a building that had been designed, with considerable and not entirely successful effort, to make all of this information legible to a single duty officer in a single glance at a single table. The man who had to make the most important decisions from this table was Max Horton, and his management of Western Approaches Command has a quality that the formal history tends to represent as merely competent, when it was actually something considerably more unusual. Horton, a submarine commander from the First World War with a reputation for aggressive and unconventional operational thinking, had taken over the command at a moment of crisis and had spent the winter of 1942 to 1943 systematically rebuilding the doctrinal and organizational foundations of the escort force. His specific hours of work, sleeping from early evening to approximately midnight, then working through the night when convoys were in danger, were structured around the operational reality that the critical decisions at Western Approaches were almost always night decisions. He was there when it mattered. His staff noted, with a mixture of admiration and controlled anxiety, that he could be woken from a full sleep, presented with a contact report, and issue a coherent tactical response within approximately 4 minutes. Several recorded this fact in post-war memoirs. The consistency of the figure across independent accounts suggests it was accurate rather than embellished. When I was working through the Derby House operational records from this period, the watch logs, the signal distribution files, the routing decision documents, I kept finding myself paying attention to the routing decisions that didn't generate any subsequent action. The convoys that were rerouted around a located Wolfpack line and arrived without incident. The signals that said, in their terse operational language, "Convoy diverted, no contact." These are the invisible victories of the campaign. The ships that didn't sink, the men who didn't drown, the cargoes that arrived because someone at 2 a.m. in Liverpool looked at a plot, read a decrypt, considered a huff-duff bearing, and drew a line on a piece of acetate in a slightly different direction. These decisions left almost no footprint in the historical record. The convoy arrived. Nobody wrote about convoys that arrived. The WRNS contribution to Derby House is the most systematically underdocumented element of the Western Approaches story, and the gap between what the official record shows and what the operational reality was represents a form of institutional erasure that persisted long after the war. Approximately 3,000 women served at Derby House at peak operation, performing the plotting, communications, and intelligence distribution functions that the command depended on absolutely. Their official designation was support staff. Their actual function was the real-time integration of intelligence, the work of maintaining the plot that allowed every officer who entered the operations room to understand, within 30 seconds, the complete operational picture of the North Atlantic. They were not making strategic decisions, but the information on which strategic decisions were made existed in its legible, current, integrated form because of the continuous labor of maintaining it. When I was reading through the post-war memoirs and oral history testimonies from Derby House Wrens, a body of material held partly at the Imperial War Museum and partly in private collections, what came through most clearly wasn't the drama of the operations room, but the weight of it. The sustained exposure to real-time information about ships going down and men dying at sea, with no psychological support, no official acknowledgement that what they were witnessing constituted anything other than administrative duty, and no combat stress protocols that extended to shore-based personnel. The women who watched the plot markers disappear from the Atlantic table were doing so without anyone having designed a framework for what that experience cost them. The organizational change that made the Derby House system most effective was the consolidation of convoy routing authority that followed the Washington Convoy Conference of March 1943. Before that conference, routing decisions for North Atlantic convoys were being made through a somewhat fragmented command structure, with the Admiralty's OIC in London, Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, and the American Comenge Organization in Washington, all having various degrees of authority over different convoy routes. The conference rationalized this. British and Canadian commands took primary responsibility for the northern convoy routes. American commands took the southern routes and the Caribbean. The communication links between these commands were formalized, and the intelligence sharing protocols were made more explicit. What the reorganization produced, in practical terms, was a coherent convoy routing system that could respond to OIC intelligence across the full breadth of the Atlantic in a coordinated way. When a U-boat patrol line was identified by a combination of ultra-decrypt and Huff-Duff triangulation, the routing response could be applied to all convoys approaching that zone simultaneously, rather than to whichever individual convoy happened to be in contact with its relevant command at that particular moment. The specific routing of convoy HX-233 in April of 1943 illustrates how the system worked when it functioned well. The convoy was approaching the mid-Atlantic from the west when OIC tracking identified a German patrol line directly across its route. A combination of an ultra-decrypt, several Huff-Duff bearings from shore stations, and WIN's inferential assessment of where the patrol line would have repositioned from its last known location. Derby House issued a routing order that diverted HX-233 to the north of the identified line. The diversion was covered by a cover story involving a fictitious aircraft sighting. The convoy arrived without any contact with the patrol line. No ships were lost, no merchant seamen were killed. In the operational records, this appears as a convoy transit without incident, a non-event. In the intelligence files, it appears as a successful ultra operation. Neither record captures what actually happened, which was that a specific combination of cryptographic skill, inferential analysis, organizational efficiency, and the physical labor of women maintaining an acetate overlay at 3 in the morning in Liverpool had kept 40 ships and their crews alive. The Derby House plot table, the physical object, the glass-covered Atlantic, still exists in the Western Approaches Museum in Liverpool, which occupies the original Derby House building. The conservation team that undertook detailed restoration work on the table in recent years found, beneath multiple layers of subsequent preservation, the ghost of a grease pencil line. The double stroke that WRNS plotters used to mark convoy diversion orders. The conservation note identifies it as almost certainly dating from the spring of 1943 and describes it as consistent in its direction with a routing diversion away from a wolf pack group active in that area during that period. The line is perhaps 20 centimeters long. It represents, in physical form, a decision made at some hour of some morning in 1943 by someone whose name is not recorded anywhere in the archive. A thin double line in grease pencil on a glass table, half a century old. The convoy it diverted may have been one that arrived safely. We don't know. The record, as usual, speaks most loudly about the things that went wrong. By the autumn of 1943, the Western Approaches Operations Room was tracking a North Atlantic that had changed almost beyond recognition from the one it had been monitoring at the beginning of the year. The convoy loss rate had fallen to a fraction of its March peak.
The Wolfpack operations that had generated the SC-122 disaster were no longer being mounted at anything like their previous scale. The plot that had, in February and March, been updated with the loss markers of 2 and 3 ships per day was now going days at a time without a loss notation. The Wrens still maintained it, the duty officers still watched it. Horton still came to the operations room after midnight. The system that had been built to manage a crisis was still running, with the same precision and the same human effort, in what was beginning to feel, tentatively, like the aftermath of one. Chapter 14. The Submariner's Last Letters. Loss, Morale, and What Denitz Told His Men. The 12th of June, 1943. Lorient, France. The German submarine base on the Brittany coast has the particular atmosphere of a military installation that has been running at high operational tempo for too long. Everything functional, everything maintained, nothing relaxed. The concrete pens that house the submarines are massive, cold, and impervious to anything the RAF has managed to drop on them. The town outside them has not been impervious. The streets carry the scars of the February bombing raids in ways that the pens do not, which says something about what the raids were actually hitting. In the base postal office, a sealed envelope is waiting to be collected for censorship processing and onward dispatch. It was left by a watch officer who sailed 3 days ago. The envelope has a fold mark in it, an offset crease, 3 millimeters displaced from the original, where a censor's hands have opened and resealed it. Inside, a letter. The handwriting is careful. The opening line references the weather and the coffee. There is no mention of where the writer is going or when he expects to return. The base postal officer knows the boat's sailing date and the patrol assignment. He knows, statistically, what those details mean. The German U-boat arms casualty rate across the full course of the war was, by any comparative measure, extraordinary in its severity. Roughly 30,000 U-boat crewmen were killed, out of approximately 40,000 who served. That is a mortality rate of approximately 75% across the full war period, a figure that represents the highest proportional loss rate of any service branch in any nation in the entire conflict. In 1943 specifically, approximately 242 submarines were lost, and the human cost attached to those boats, given crew complements averaging 44 men, was in the range of 9,000 to 10,000 men killed in a single year. The average age of a German U-boat crew member in 1943 was 21 years old. These are numbers. They are accurate numbers, drawn from post-war German naval records and confirmed by multiple independent historical analyses. They are also, if you stay with them long enough to feel their weight, something beyond numbers. The internal morale documentation from the U-boat arm in the second half of 1943 is a body of material that the popular histories of the Atlantic campaign have tended to use selectively, quoting Donitz's public assertions of sustained fighting spirit while leaving the internal psychological assessments largely unexamined. The German naval medical officers who were filing formal morale reports from mid-1943 onward were using clinical language to describe conditions that the official narrative couldn't accommodate. The reports document increasing rates of what they term effective Erschöpfung, effective exhaustion, and growing numbers of men presenting with sleep disturbances, anxiety responses, and what the reports describe in careful medical terminology as subconscious disturbances. By the autumn of 1943, several formal medical review boards had been convened, specifically to assess the mental state of returning crews. In the language of those reviews, again filtered through the specific conventions of German naval medical documentation, makes clear that what was being observed went beyond ordinary combat fatigue. Donitz's post-war memoir insists that morale throughout this period remained high. The medical reports from the same months describe something different. Both documents exist. They cannot both be entirely right. The letters that German U-boat crew members sent home, those that were preserved, that survived the war in family collections or were captured and retained in archives, have a quality that is difficult to characterize without misrepresenting it. They don't, on the whole,
read as the letters of men who believed they were going to die. They read as the letters of men who had made peace with the possibility and were focused on the things they cared about: their families, their homes, small domestic details that the ocean's distance made luminous. A man writing about the specific way afternoon light fell in a particular room of a particular house. A man asking whether the apple tree had fruited well that autumn. A man describing with evident pleasure the smell of bread baking in the galley in the first days of a patrol before the provisions ran out. These are not heroic documents. They are human ones, and I think it matters to say so, even in a history of a campaign in which the men who wrote them were engaged in an enterprise that was, in its strategic purpose, an attempt to starve an island nation into surrender. The shore leave reports from Lorient and Brest in the summer and autumn of 1943 tell a story that the official record doesn't quite know how to hold. German naval police reports from both bases document a statistically measurable increase in alcohol-related incidents, minor disciplinary infractions, and unauthorized absences from June onward, a pattern that is distinguishable from the pre-Black May baseline and that the base commanders noted in their own internal assessments with varying degrees of candor. These weren't dramatic acts of resistance. They weren't mutinies or formal refusals of duty. They were the behavioral signature of men who had recalculated the probabilities and were responding to that recalculation in the limited ways available to them within a military culture that had no framework for acknowledging what those probabilities meant. The man who took an extra hour on shore leave. The petty officer whose alcohol consumption had increased since his last patrol. The rating whose medical self-referral was, in the assessment of the base medical officer, motivated by something other than the physical symptoms described. These small resistances appear in the records as disciplinary matters. They were, in the aggregate, an expression of something else. The speeches that Dönitz delivered to newly commissioned crews at the Atlantic bases through the summer and autumn of 1943 are preserved in the BDU records, and in some cases in the memoirs of men who heard them. The language of these speeches followed a consistent pattern: duty, sacrifice, the decisive strategic importance of the submarine campaign, the certainty of technological solutions that would restore the operational advantage, the honor of service in the most demanding arm of the German military. The speeches were not cynical performances, I don't think. Or at least the record doesn't support that conclusion. Dönitz appears to have believed, at some level, in the content of what he was saying. He was a man of considerable personal courage, who had commanded submarines in the First World War, and who measured other men against the standard he had set for himself. But reading those speeches against the operational data he was simultaneously recording in his war diary, the loss rates, the exchange ratios, the withdrawal orders, produces a dissonance that is difficult to read without discomfort. He was telling young men that their sacrifice was decisive, while recording, in a parallel document, the evidence that it was not. There is a specific category of record in the Bundesarchiv that I want to draw attention to, because it appears in almost no historical account of the campaign, and because it illuminates something about the administrative texture of loss that the battle statistics cannot convey. In several cases in the U-boat records, the files on individual boats that failed to return include correspondence from the families of crew members who continued to write to the BDU base postal address for weeks and sometimes months after the boat was officially listed as missing. A mother asking whether there was any further news. A wife enclosing a photograph and asking that it be forwarded if communications permitted. A father writing to inquire whether the boat had reached a neutral port. The BDU responses to these letters, standardized forms with blanks for the boat number and the commander's name, are in the same files as the letters that prompted them. The form letter and the personal letter, together in the same folder, are a specific and terrible kind of document. The form letter had a template because it was needed frequently. The survival statistics that were filtering through the U-boat arms' informal communication networks by the summer of 1943 were, by all accounts, accurate enough in their general outlines, even without access to official figures. Men talked. Crews came back, the ones that came back. And the ratio of the ones who came back to the ones who didn't was observable without needing an admiralty analysis. The flotilla commanders knew.
The engineering officers who kept track of boats expected back and boats arrived knew. The families waiting at the bases knew, with a specific and growing precision, what the absence of news meant. Official Germany was maintaining a narrative of continuing operational effectiveness and strategic relevance. The men living inside the operational reality were measuring something different, and the gap between the official narrative and the measured reality was, by the autumn of 1943, wide enough that official narrative required conscious effort to sustain. Dönitz outlived the war. He was tried at Nuremberg on charges that included waging unrestricted submarine warfare and complicity in the broader crimes of the Nazi regime. He was acquitted of the war crimes charges relating to submarine warfare, partly because American Admiral Chester Nimitz submitted evidence confirming that the United States Navy had followed similar unrestricted submarine doctrine in the Pacific, and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment on other charges. He served his full sentence. He was released in 1956. He died in 1980, aged 89, and was buried with full military honors attended by surviving U-boat veterans. His post-war memoir presented the submarine campaign as an honorable military effort conducted within the laws of war, and the question of whether that characterization is accurate is one that historians continue to assess. What the internal record shows, the morale reports, the loss statistics he continued to suppress, the men he continued to send to sea after the mathematics had resolved against them, is a dimension of his leadership that the memoir does not address directly, and that the popular history of the campaign has not fully absorbed. Chapter 15. The Road to Overlord. Why the Atlantic had to be won before France could be invaded. The summer of 1943. Washington, a building that smells of paper and cigarette smoke and the particular tension of a place where very large decisions are being made in a very compressed time frame. A United States Army logistics officer, one of hundreds working on the operational planning for what will eventually be codenamed Operation Overlord, is sitting with a spreadsheet. Not a computer spreadsheet, a physical one. A large sheet of paper ruled into columns, filled with figures in pencil that have been erased and rewritten enough times that the paper has a particular texture of accumulated revision. The column headings include tonnage categories, vehicles, fuel, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, bridging equipment, spare parts, artillery ammunition by caliber. The bottom line of the sheet is a single monthly figure: 987,000 gross tons of shipping. That is the minimum tonnage that has to cross the Atlantic safely every month to sustain the buildup of forces in Britain that an invasion of occupied Europe requires. The figure was not calculated optimistically. It was calculated as a minimum. And in May of 1943, it had, for the first time, become a number that the Atlantic appeared capable of delivering. The connection between the Battle of the Atlantic and Operation Overlord is usually stated in general terms. The Atlantic had to be won before the invasion could be mounted. But the precision of the dependency is rarely examined in the detail it deserves. Operation Bolero, the code name for the American military buildup in Britain, had been conceived as a multi-year program of troop, equipment, and supply movements across the North Atlantic. Its timeline was not fixed arbitrarily. It was calculated against projected Atlantic security, against the estimated rate at which U-boat losses would allow safe convoy transit, and against the production rate of both the ships needed for the crossing and the equipment needed for the invasion itself. When the combined chiefs of staff, meeting at the Trident Conference in Washington in May of 1943, committed to an invasion target date in the spring of 1944, subsequently postponed to the 6th of June for meteorological reasons, that commitment was made possible, in a logistical sense, by the events of the previous weeks in the North Atlantic. Black May had happened. The convoy routes were opening. The mathematics, for the first time, was going the right way. The specific logistics of moving an army across the Atlantic deserve a moment of technical attention, because the scale is genuinely difficult to grasp without figures. Moving a fully equipped American armored division from the United States to Britain required approximately 120,000 gross tons of shipping for the personnel, the vehicles, the armored fighting vehicles, the artillery, the fuel, the ammunition, the spare parts, and the 90 days of operational supplies that doctrine required to be pre-positioned before the division could be considered ready for offensive operations. The 20 or so American divisions that would eventually be staged in Britain for Overlord required approximately 2.5 million gross tons of shipping to deliver. Against the U-boat loss rate of March 1943, when roughly 2% of Atlantic convoy shipping was being sunk per crossing, this kind of buildup was not achievable at any rate that could support a 1944 invasion timeline. Against the loss rate of the autumn of 1943, a fraction of a percent, it was achievable, barely, if the yards kept building and the escorts kept sailing. What the Trident Conference minutes contain that is rarely quoted is a specific logistics appendix, a table of minimum monthly gross tonnage requirements for the Bolero buildup, month by month from the start of the program through the projected first 18 months of Overlord operations. The month 1 figure, 987,000 gross tons, was not a target. It was a floor. Below it, the buildup couldn't sustain an invasion force at the required strength. The planners who produced this table had built the Atlantic battle into the Overlord timeline as a variable, and in the spring and summer of 1943, that variable was resolving. The table existed because someone had done the arithmetic. The arithmetic required the North Atlantic to be manageable. Black May had made it manageable. The connection is direct, specific, and consequential enough that it ought to appear in every history of D-Day. It appears in very few. The speed immunity of the large American troop transports deserves a specific mention because it represents a strand of the Atlantic story that operates almost entirely separately from the convoy narrative. Ships like the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, requisitioned from civilian service and converted to troop carriers, were capable of approximately 28 knots. They crossed the Atlantic independently, no convoy formation, no escort, just speed and a zigzag navigation pattern designed to defeat torpedo fire control solutions. At 28 knots, with a course alteration every 5 minutes, the geometry of a torpedo attack became effectively unsolvable for any U-boat that wasn't already positioned directly on the ship's track. The Queen Mary carried as many as 15,000 American troops on a single crossing in this period, an extraordinary density that the ship's designers had never anticipated and that the military planners accepted as an acceptable risk given the speed protection. A torpedo hit on either vessel would have been catastrophic in human terms. Neither was ever successfully attacked. The U-boat that wanted to sink a fast liner needed to be in precisely the right place at precisely the right moment, in a crossing that lasted approximately 4 days and covered an ocean of millions of square miles. The probability wasn't zero. It was close enough to zero that the operational judgment was made and maintained throughout the war. The relationship between the Atlantic clearing and the Churchill-Stalin correspondence of the second half of 1943 is another of those connections that the popular history handles at a level of generality that misses the specificity. At the Quebec Conference in August of 1943, Churchill was able to commit, with a confidence that had been genuinely absent from earlier Allied strategic discussions, to an Overlord timeline in the spring of 1944. Stalin had been pressing for a second front in Western Europe since 1941, and the Allied inability to commit to a firm date had been a persistent source of tension in the three-power relationship. The Quebec commitment was possible because the Bolero buildup was now on track. The Bolero buildup was on track because the Atlantic convoy routes were functioning at a loss rate that the logistical planning could absorb. The loss rate was what it was because the events of May 1943 had happened. The line from Black May to the Quebec commitment to the D-Day decision is direct, though it runs through several layers of logistical mathematics that the dramatic narratives tend to skip. When I was reading through the Bolero shipping records and the Overlord logistics appendices together, trying to feel the shape of the dependency rather than just its existence, I found myself repeatedly struck by the Liberty ship fracture problem that had been quietly fixed in the steel specification revisions of mid-1943. The revised specification, the higher manganese ABSC steel grade mandated for all hulls from September of that year, was implemented at precisely the moment when the volume of Atlantic crossings was beginning to approach the levels that the Overlord timeline required. If the fracture defect had continued uncorrected into the high-volume Bolero crossing period, the statistical probability of structural failures in the accelerated Atlantic traffic would have been non-trivial. The fix happened quietly, efficiently, and without public disclosure. The ships built to the new specification crossed without incident. Nobody wrote about ships that crossed without incident. The correction is in the engineering files at the Maritime Commission, and essentially nowhere else. The autumn of 1943 saw the Atlantic convoy routes functioning, by the standards of the previous 4 years, was something approaching normality, though that word requires careful qualification, because normal Atlantic crossing in any season retained hazards that had nothing to do with U-boats. The weather was still the weather. The ocean was still the ocean. Ships still broke down, still ran into each other in fog, still faced the navigation challenges of a 3,000-mile passage without GPS or satellite weather. But the specific organized violence of the Wolfpack system had been withdrawn from the main routes, and the loss rate had fallen to levels that the logistical planning could work with. The Bolero convoys were crossing. The tonnage was accumulating in British ports and depots. The ammunition dumps, the fuel storage facilities, the vehicle parks, the pre-positioned medical supplies. All of the material infrastructure of an invasion army was growing, week by week, in the English countryside, sustained by a supply chain that ran from American factories and fields across the North Atlantic to the island that was going to be the launch platform for the liberation of Western Europe. By December of 1943, the cumulative Allied shipping replacement rate had, for the first time in the war, exceeded the cumulative wartime loss rate. The net Allied merchant fleet tonnage, the number arrived at after subtracting everything sunk from everything built since September 1939, was larger than it had been at the start of the war. This crossover point, occurring in the final weeks of 1943, is one of the most significant single statistics in the entire history of the Second World War. It means that from that date forward, the Allies could sustain any operationally feasible level of maritime logistics without constraint. The tonnage war was not just being won. It had been rendered mathematically irreversible. Someone in a Washington office building calculated that crossover point from production figures and loss records. They may not have paused to consider what it represented. It represented the moment at which the strategic outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic became a fixed point in the future of the war. Chapter 16. The Men Who Never Came Back. U-boat losses in 1943 and the Atlantic Graveyard. The winter of 1944. A room in the Admiralty's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division. On the table, a standard Admiralty chart of the North Atlantic. A large, careful piece of cartography in the blue-gray tones that Admiralty printing used for deep water. Someone has been overprinting this chart with small black crosses. 1 cross per submarine confirmed lost in 1943. 242 crosses, placed at the reported positions of the losses, as accurately as the available records allow. The chart has been prepared for post-campaign operational analysis, an attempt to understand not just how many submarines were lost, but where, by what means, and in what pattern. The crosses are not evenly distributed. They cluster. They cluster most densely in 2 zones, along the approaches to the British Isles, in the western approaches and the Channel approaches, where convoy traffic was heaviest and where the escort forces were most fully deployed, and across the Bay of Biscay, where 15 boats were lost in May alone during the transit campaign that turned the obligatory passage into a gauntlet. The Mid-Atlantic, the air gap zone that had been the Wolfpack's most productive hunting ground, shows relatively sparse crosses. The air gap had been closed in May. The boats were dying on the approaches before they could reach it. The causal breakdown of the 242 U-boat losses in 1943, reconstructed from post-war analysis of Allied operational records, German war diary entries, and in some cases physical wreck surveys, offers a precise quantification of what the Allied technological and doctrinal revolution had achieved. Surface ships, destroyers, frigates, corvettes, deploying depth charges, hedgehog, and in several cases the controlled violence of a deliberate ramming, were responsible for approximately 43% of total losses. Aircraft of all types, including the very long-range Liberators, Sunderlands, and carrier-based aircraft, accounted for approximately 37%. Combined surface and air operations, where both types contributed to a single kill, added approximately 7%. Mines, primarily in the Bay of Biscay and the approaches to French ports, accounted for approximately 5%. The remaining 8% of losses were recorded as unknown or missing, boats that didn't return and sent no final signal, whose fate the archive can approach but not definitively determine. The unknown and missing category deserves its own consideration, because it contains within it a specific kind of loss that the other categories don't capture. A boat that was depth-charged to the surface, whose crew abandoned ship and was captured, generates records on both sides. The Allied after-action report confirming the kill, the German records updating the boat's status to lost. A boat that was sunk by an aircraft whose crew filed a kill report, backed by a photograph of an oil slick and debris, generates similar documentation. A boat that simply failed to return, that passed some point in the North Atlantic and then ceased to exist, without anyone on either side directly witnessing the event, generates only an absence. The BDU War Diary notation for these losses follows a particular pattern. A daily entry that begins, "No signal received from," followed by the boat number, repeated for several weeks as the expected return date passes and then recedes, until a final entry that reads simply that the boat is to be written off as lost. The transition from "no signal received" to "written off" happens in most cases on the date when the boat's fuel supply would mathematically have been exhausted. After that date, it could not be anywhere. Before that date, it might still be somewhere. The diary maintained the distinction until it couldn't. The wreck of U-175 sunk on the 17th of April, 1943, by the United States Coast Guard cutters Spencer and Duane during a convoy escort operation, was located and surveyed by a submersible expedition decades after the war. The boat lies at approximately 2,700 meters depth in the North Atlantic. The survey photographs show a pressure hull that is largely intact amidships, but has collapsed at the conning tower junction, a pattern consistent with depth charge damage severe enough to cause structural failure in the transition zone between the tower base and the main hull. The crew complement was 54 men. 7 survived and were recovered from the water. The after-action report from USS Spencer credits a specific depth charge pattern as the primary cause of loss, based on the observed behavior of the submarine before it disappeared from ASDIT contact. A post-war analysis of the wreck photographs suggested that the terminal damage may have been caused by a contact at the bow planes rather than the cited depth charge run. The two accounts describe the same event from different evidential bases and reach slightly different conclusions. The 7 men who survived could not say which was right. The 47 who didn't cannot say anything. What the survey photographs of Atlantic U-boat wrecks reveal, in aggregate, is a specific physical record of how these boats ended. The pressure hull of a Type 7, rated to a working depth of approximately 200 meters and a theoretical crush depth somewhat beyond that, fails in a predictable pattern when subjected to overpressure. Frames buckle inward, hull plates crack at the weld seams, flooding enters rapidly through the breach. At depths below the rated crush depth, the failure is effectively instantaneous, a matter of milliseconds. At depths near or slightly above the rated limit, under the hydrostatic pressure of a deep depth charge attack, the failure could be progressive, a slow inward deformation of frames and plates, leakage beginning before structural collapse, an intermediate period of compressed time between the first indication of failure and the end. The survivor accounts from boats that were brought near destruction and then escaped, a small but documented group, describe this intermediate state in the language available to them, which is the language of sound and movement and the behavior of the men around them, rather than the language of engineering analysis. The hull making noises it didn't make before, water appearing where there had been no water, a pressure change that affected hearing. These accounts exist. Reading them requires a specific kind of care. The demographic pattern of U-boat losses in 1943 contains an operational truth that the simple aggregate figures don't show. When you sort the losses by the number of Atlantic patrols the lost boat had completed before its final voyage, a pattern emerges. Crews on their first or second patrol were dying at a substantially higher rate than crews on their third or fourth. The attrition of the experienced crews, the men who had learned through multiple crossings the specific operational instincts that kept a boat alive, had been accelerating since the autumn of 1942. And by the summer of 1943, the replacement crews arriving at the Atlantic bases had, in many cases, compressed training periods and limited sea time. The operational record shows the consequence. Newer crews were making the kinds of errors in dive timing, in-depth estimation, and the management of a depth charge attack that experienced crews had learned to avoid. The Wolfpack system had been designed around the accumulated expertise of a trained submarine force. That force was being consumed faster than it could be replaced, and the replacement crews were inheriting an operational environment that their training had not fully prepared them for. The United States Coast Guard's contribution to the Atlantic anti-submarine effort is one of the more systematically overlooked elements of the campaign in the English-language historiography. And I want to be specific about this because the oversight is not merely a matter of emphasis. Coast Guard cutters, vessels that were technically law enforcement ships operated by a civilian agency of the federal government, pressed into naval service for the duration of the war, were responsible for a number of significant U-boat kills in 1943, including the confirmed sinking of U-175, U-166, and U-521, among others. The Coast Guard personnel who conducted these operations were performing naval anti-submarine warfare in the North Atlantic under conditions essentially identical to those faced by their Navy and Royal Navy counterparts. Their kills appear in the historical record. Their institutional identity as Coast Guard rather than Navy has caused those kills to be routinely absorbed into the general U.S. Navy narrative in popular accounts, with the specific institutional attribution lost. The Cutter Spencer's crew who prosecuted and sank U-175 were not Navy. They were Coast Guard. The distinction has been erased from most retellings. The formal ending of the main Atlantic crisis, the statistical and operational closure of the period that this series has been documenting, came without ceremony, without a formal declaration, without the kind of public moment that history tends to assign to its turning points. There was no ceremony at Derby House, no announcement, no single date on which someone stood up and said, "The worst is over." What happened instead was the Atlantic plot at Derby House becoming, gradually, a less terrible document. The loss markers appearing less frequently, the Wolfpack group symbols thinning and then largely disappearing from the main routes, the convoy arrival notifications accumulating without the corresponding loss entries that had accompanied them for years. The system that had been built to manage catastrophe continued running at the same pace, with the same human effort, watching an ocean that was, in the autumn and winter of 1943, recovering from what had been done to it. 14 months of Wolfpack operations. 242 submarines lost in 1 year alone. A final crossover point in December, when the replacement tonnage exceeded the total losses for the first time. The Atlantic didn't announce any of this. It just continued, as it always had, doing what it did. Chapter 17. The Longest Campaign's Longest Shadow. What 1943 made possible, and what it cost. Sometime in the autumn of 1943, the North Atlantic. A convoy, westbound, mostly in ballast, ships returning to North America to load again, is 3 days out of Liverpool. The sea is force 4, moderate, the kind of North Atlantic autumn weather that sailors describe as acceptable and that nobody would describe as comfortable. On the bridge of the convoy Commodore's vessel, the officer of the watch is maintaining his log. The entries are routine: course, speed, weather observation, visibility, fuel state, convoy formation. There is a huff duff set on the mast, and it is silent. There is a radar set sweeping the surface, and it is showing nothing but the other ships of the convoy and the occasional seabird. The escort commander's daily signal contains no U-boat contacts, no huff duff bearings, no intelligence reports indicating patrol lines ahead.
The convoy is crossing the mid-Atlantic in the zone that, 7 months ago, was the most dangerous stretch of water in the world. And there is nothing there. Not nothing in the dramatic sense, not a trap waiting to be sprung. Nothing in the literal sense. The ocean is doing what oceans do when nobody is fighting in them. It is being an ocean. That routine crossing, the crossing that generated no entries worth noting in any history, that appears in the records as a voyage without incident, was itself the product of everything that had happened in the preceding 12 months. The very long-range aircraft that were flying somewhere above, the escort ships whose Huff-Duff operators were monitoring a frequency that had gone silent, the Derby House plot that was tracking the convoy without alarm, all of it running as a system, quietly and effectively, through an ocean that had cost an almost incomprehensible amount of human effort to make passable. The absence of violence on that convoy crossing was not the absence of consequence. It was the consequence. Every ship that arrived in the autumn and winter of 1943, loaded with the equipment and fuel and ammunition that the Overlord buildup required, was a direct product of the spring's events. The silence of the mid-Atlantic in October was what May had purchased. In October of 1943, Admiral Horton wrote a private assessment of the Atlantic campaign's current state, a letter to the First Sea Lord that is, by the standards of official naval correspondence, unusually candid. The letter is held in the National Archives. He identified 4 specific factors that he considered most important in the campaign's reversal: the very long-range aircraft that had closed the air gap, the operational research findings on convoy geometry and depth charge settings, the Huff-Duff fitting to escort ships, and the adoption of aggressive pursuit doctrine by the escort groups. He did not mention Ultra in the letter. He was writing to the First Sea Lord. He knew what could and could not be written in documents that, however secure their distribution, circulated beyond the inner circle of the intelligence secret. His silence about Ultra in that letter is not evidence that he considered it unimportant. It is evidence of the extraordinary discipline with which the intelligence source was protected, even in private communications between the most senior naval officers. The letter says 4 things. It means 5. The residual U-boat campaign of 1944 and 1945 is a chapter that most histories of the Battle of the Atlantic treat as a coda, a prolonged and costly footnote to a decision that had already been made. Dunitz did not see it that way, and the operational records show a man continuing to pursue a strategic objective with a determination that the casualty figures made increasingly difficult to sustain intellectually. He continued sending boats to sea. Some of those boats, equipped with the Schnorkel and the T-5, achieved localized operational success. The last Allied merchant ship sunk by a U-boat was the SS Avondale Park, torpedoed in the Firth of Forth on the 7th of May, 1945, the day before the German surrender. The crew of whatever submarine fired that torpedo were fighting a war that had, in strategic terms, been over for nearly 2 years. The Avondale Park went down, and the surrender documents were signed the following day. The 2 events are separated by less than 24 hours, and by the full width of the campaign's meaning. The Type 21 U-boat, the advanced electro-submarine that Donitz have been developing as the answer to every Allied improvement, deserves a specific technical note because it was, in objective engineering terms, a genuine revolution that arrived too late to change anything. The Type 21 used a figure-8 pressure hull cross-section that increased internal volume by approximately 30% compared to a Type 7 of the same outer diameter. It carried a battery bank 3 times the capacity of the older boat. Its submerged speed was approximately 17 knots, faster than most Allied escort vessels, fast enough to attack and evade without ever needing to surface. Its Schnorkel system was more refined than the retrofitted versions on older boats. It could fire torpedoes from depth without any periscope use. 118 were laid down. 4 made combat patrols before the surrender. None sank a ship. The United States Navy, having captured several examples in the closing weeks of the war, spent the following years reverse engineering the design. The American Tang-class submarines, commissioned in 1951, owed substantial design debts to the Type 21. Germany's most advanced weapon was absorbed into the naval architecture of the force that had defeated it. The Battle of the Atlantic in 1943 cost, in the aggregate that the final accounting produces, approximately 3,500 Allied merchant ships, 175 Allied warships, 783 German submarines, 36,000 Allied naval dead, 36,000 Allied merchant marine dead, and 30,000 German U-boat crewmen killed, these being the full war figures, with 1943 representing the single most intensive year of loss on both sides. Behind these numbers are things the numbers cannot contain. The specific weight of a letter written 4 times by a careful man, a grease pencil line on a glass table, a 14-second huff-duff bearing that found a boat in the dark, an 11-second pause on a tape recording before an old man said, "We just kept going." The numbers are real and accurate. They are also the roughest possible approximation of what actually happened. The merchant seamen who kept Britain supplied throughout this campaign received, as their formal institutional recognition, a long and contested silence. The Merchant Navy Medal for meritorious service was not instituted until March of 2023, 78 years after the end of the war. It is not a campaign medal. A campaign medal for the Atlantic, equivalent to the campaign medals issued to Royal Navy personnel and to every other branch of the armed forces, was never issued to the men who suffered the highest proportional casualty rate of any service in the British war effort. The campaigns to achieve this recognition persisted for decades, pressed by aging veterans associations and the families of men who hadn't survived to press it themselves. The men who loaded and crewed the ships that fed Britain, who sailed through the air gap in the Wolfpack lines in the North Atlantic winter, who stopped receiving pay the moment a torpedo hit their ship, received their formal acknowledgement in 2023. Many of them were gone by then. The ones who were still alive were in their 90s. The Overlord landings on the 6th of June 1944 consumed approximately 280,000 gross tons of shipping in their opening phase. Vehicles, ammunition, fuel, equipment, the material infrastructure of an army assault on a fortified coastline. Behind that tonnage stood the Atlantic Campaign and the year that turned it. Behind the year that turned it stood the operations research analysts with their graph paper, the Huff-Duff operators with their headphones, the Wren plotters with their grease pencils, the Corvette engineers fabricating replacement bearings from lathes and overheated engine spaces, the masters of merchant ships sailing routes they knew were dangerous because the routes needed sailing. Behind all of them stood a mathematics of industrial capacity and scientific capability and institutional will that had, through the specific and irreversible events of a single year, resolved in one direction rather than the other. The resolution was not inevitable. The people who made it happen were not interchangeable. The archive, read carefully, shows the difference between the world where it went one way and the world where it might have gone another. And the difference is measured in the specific decisions of specific people in specific moments that the record has mostly forgotten to name. There is a tape recording in the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive, catalog number 9723. In which a British merchant seaman who served on the North Atlantic run from 1940 to 1945 is asked by his interviewer when he knew the worst was over. There is a pause of approximately 11 seconds on the tape. The pause is not in the transcript. The transcript, filed in 1987, moves directly from the question to his answer. But the tape preserves the 11 seconds, and they contain something that the transcript cannot. The specific sound of a man who has been asked to locate, in memory and language, an experience that did not come with clear edges or legible endings. The worst didn't end with an announcement. It didn't end with a ceremony. It ended the way the sea changes, gradually, and then all at once. And then you were on the other side of it, still sailing, not quite sure when you'd cross the line. After 11 seconds, he said, "We didn't. We just kept going." Then, "You don't get told that kind of thing at sea." The interviewer noted the answer. The tape preserved the silence before it. The Atlantic preserved everything else.